Chapter 1975. The reason for this was very simple. Previously, the search for the great Tianyuan world had involved searching through the countless stars in the sky. The number had reached an infinite level, so it was naturally extremely difficult to find a specific star. However, the search for the great Jili world this time was different. This time, he had to search through the stars that did not have any overlapping images. Although the number of stars in the sky was endless, the number of stars that truly did not have any overlapping images, which was suspected to be the great Tianyuan world, was only an extremely small portion of it. Although it was still difficult to calculate exactly how many there were, the difficulty was still tens of thousands of times lower than before. Under such circumstances, the amount of time needed to find the Jili Great World was naturally much less than it had been before. In the end, after locking onto the great Jili World, Luo Fan was completely certain of one thing. Among the stars that filled the sky, the stars that did not have any overlapping images really did represent the great Tianyuan world. The great Tianyuan world actually has no other timelines, nor does it have any other perfect spacetime dimensions. What does this mean? This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and his expression became indescribably solemn. At this moment, he faintly knew that if he was able to figure this out, then it would be extremely beneficial to his cultivation. It was even to the extent that it might allow him to make a huge leap and step into a level that he couldn't even imagine in the past. The difference between a perfect world and a great Tianyuan world was this great tribulation. Therefore, it could be imagined. For the great Tianyuan world to obtain such a characteristic that was completely different from a perfect world, it clearly relied on the 9 great tribulations. According to the previous situation, where Luo Fan had helped the great Tianyuan world survive the great Tianyuan world, up until the 8th great Tianyuan world, when the great Tianyuan world completely stripped away the mark of the creator of the great Tianyuan world, it still did not erase other spacetime dimensions and other timelines. In other words, it was obvious that only the 9th great tribulation of the heavens and earth in a perfect world could achieve such an effect. The 9th great Tianyuan world. Luo Fan instantly locked onto this crucial point. He had never encountered any great Tianyuan world's 9th great Tianyuan world. That was the Earth universe. Now it was only about to face the 8th great Tianyuan world, even in the timeline after the shattering of the world. It was only the 8th great tribulation of heaven and earth, and was about to step onto the 9th great tribulation of heaven and earth. Under such circumstances, he had no understanding of the 9th great tribulation of the heavens and earth. He had no idea what kind of situation the 9th great tribulation of the heavens and earth would appear, and what kind of terrifying effect it would have after it was triggered. Facing such a situation, he was finally able to obtain some of the characteristics of the 9th great tribulation of the world. His mood was inexplicably complicated. The reason why it was so complicated was very simple. In terms of information, it was related to the 9th great tribulation of heaven and earth. This was naturally something to be happy about. However, on the other hand, he was even more confused about why the 9th great tribulation of the world would achieve such an effect. He did not know how it would achieve such an effect. In fact, he could not even imagine it. How should he resist such a change? If he pushed it further, he would also encounter 9 great tribulations. This was somewhat similar to the 9 great tribulations of the world. What was the connection between them? Was his own great tribulation of heaven and earth as incredible and terrifying as this? After thinking for a long time, Luo Fan finally sighed and threw these thoughts to the back of his mind. Right now, his perception of the 4th great tribulation was rather blurry. It was like an illusion. Under such circumstances, he would be biting off more than he could chew if he were to consider the situation of the 9th great tribulation. His heart stirred slightly. He focused his gaze on the endless starry sky in front of him at this moment and once again sensed and searched. The target of his search was none other than the primordial world. Compared to searching the great Tianyuan world and the great Jili world, the difficulty of searching the primordial world was many times easier. In just a few days, he had already found the star that he was extremely familiar with dozens of stars away from the Earth universe. It was the star that represented the primordial world. With a slight look, he saw that there was a faint and wonderful connection between the Earth universe and the primordial world. This wonderful connection seemed illusory and real at the same time. It connected the two, causing an indescribable mutual influence. How did this appear? Is it because these two worlds were created by the same person? Or rather, were they created by two similar existences? Luo Fan looked at this scene and thought to himself. With this thought, he vaguely understood that perhaps the reason why the Earth universe could obtain all kinds of legends about the primordial world was because of the existence of this connection. In fact, it was because of this connection that he could transmigrate and return to the Earth universe. As his thoughts changed, the connection also changed slightly. Sometimes it became stronger, sometimes it weakened, sometimes it became more real, and sometimes it became more illusory. The moment he found the primordial world, he felt that the connection between his main body and his avatar was suddenly strengthened. In an instant, his avatar gradually transformed and resonated with his main body. The two communicated with each other and exchanged with each other. Not long after, they merged perfectly and became a complete body again. There was no longer any difference between the avatar and the main body. In other words, at this moment, his main body was the avatar, and the avatar was also the main body. The two were basically 1 and 2, 2 and 1. It's finally completely established. At this moment, an inexplicable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. It seemed to be happy, but also seemed to be regretful. Everything that had happened now was proof of the idealistic nature of the state of chaos. The distance between his avatar and his main body was still the same as before. There was no essential change at all. But it was because he found the existence of the primordial world, because he knew where his main body was. The relationship between the two changed in an instant. It was as if the two had suddenly returned to the same world from different worlds. This indescribable characteristic made Luo Fan have all kinds of inexplicable insights into the state of chaos. He faintly felt that his understanding of the state of chaos had been strengthened. After carefully comprehending the insights brought about by this inexplicable change, Luo Fan slowly sat down cross-legged. He began to close his eyes. His mind gradually sank into the source of his life, into the ball with the ring on it. That was naturally his view of the world. And at this time, what he needed to do was nothing else but to change his worldview. It must be known that ever since he had confirmed that the gap between the world and the state of primal chaos was not as he had imagined, that there was a real barrier between the two, but a gradual process of change, his worldview had already become different from his understanding of the world and the universe. And this also meant that at that time, he already needed to adjust his worldview. He already needed to adjust his view of the world in order to integrate it with his own knowledge. However, after that, because of various encounters, he could not immediately start such adjustment. That was why he waited until now to start this transformation. Of course, the facts also proved that his wait was worth it. Because it was precisely because of such waiting that he had the opportunity to see the changes of this strange power, and also had the opportunity to refurbish his understanding of the state of chaos. This was crucial for him to change his worldview. Luo Fan stood there quietly. His expression was solemn, and his body gradually began to emit an inexplicable light. This light was limited to the scope of this power. Or, to put it more accurately, because of the mysterious effect this power had on time and space, even though this light had already emitted hundreds of millions of light-years and enveloped the space-time of hundreds of millions of light-years, it seemed to only be the area occupied by Luo Fan himself, compared to the platform formed by this power, it was still so insignificant. When the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline stepped onto this platform, she saw such a scene. And at this time, according to his own time in the alternate timeline, it had already been more than 10 million years since he and Luo Fan had parted ways. At this moment, the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline had not only recovered the cultivation realm she had before she abandoned herself to cultivate together with him, but she had also climbed up and was much stronger than before. Although she was still far from the current Luo Fan, she was already much stronger than the Luo Fan who had yet to overcome the third calamity. As for the strands of energy that lingered around his body, although they were still runes, there was an intrinsic difference compared to the runes from back then. They were much more exquisite and complicated. Obviously, this kind of recultivation had given her quite a lot of benefits. However, even though she had already obtained such a great benefit, the power in her eyes was still the same as what she had seen back then. She could only see the countless fragments of the world, and she was still unable to see the stars that filled the sky. She looked around and could not help but feel an inexplicable surprise in her heart. There seems to be some changes in the surroundings. This intuition made her vaguely guess that Luo Fan had suddenly cultivated in seclusion here, but it was clearly just a guess. The specifics were not something she could imagine. After observing for a long time, she finally sighed and said, "The gap between me and him is still a little big." As she sighed, a thought came to her mind and she activated the power of this mysterious power. Her body moved toward the direction she saw. Her figure moved towards the fragment of the vast world that she saw. In the blink of an eye, her figure had already disappeared within the power. And among the stars that filled the sky, a speck of light suddenly appeared on one of the stars and began to rapidly enter the depths of the star. Clearly, she had relied on the power to enter another world. Time gradually passed as she left. 10 million years, 20 million years. In the end, when Luo Fan opened his eyes, a total of 120 million years had passed. During these 120 million years, Hun Ku was not the only one. It was not only Space Maiden who had used this platform to move between the fragments of the world dozens of times. Hun Ku had also passed through this platform several times. Every time they passed through this place and saw the indescribable pressure that Luo Fan's seclusion produced, they could not help but sigh. They admired and felt helpless towards Luo Fan. Whether it was admiration or helplessness, they did not feel the slightest bit worried. It was not that they did not care about Luo Fan. Instead, it was because they had experienced it countless times in the past. They had already established strong confidence in Luo Fan, and there was already an inexplicable belief in him. That was, Luo Fan could solve everything no matter what. No matter how difficult the difficulty was, he could definitely solve it easily. As Luo Fan opened his eyes, the ball of light around his body trembled slightly, and suddenly began to shrink rapidly. The surrounding rings were compressed in an instant. The surrounding halo instantly compressed and turned into a kind of smoke that directly enveloped the ball. This kind of smoke was extremely strange. It formed a strange barrier around the sphere. Whether it was on this side or the other side of the ball, it was a gradual isolation layer. It was a kind of gradual isolation layer, as though the main body of the sphere had completely connected with the outside world, and there was no longer any absolute barrier between them. Instead, it was changing little by little, and eventually, it turned into a normal spacetime where there was nothing on the outside. This change was different from what Luo Fan knew about the gap between the world and the state of chaos. It was extremely similar. This was also the external scene of Luo Fan's various transformations of his worldview in the past 120 million years. Of course, it was also the external manifestation. At this moment, countless faint rumbles came from his body. Each of these roars seemed to be the first sound produced when the heavens and earth were split apart, as if they were the first sounds born in the universe. Amidst these rumbles, the power of laws on his body began to change continuously. Under these changes, The aura on his body began to leak out and began to rise continuously. It was like a torch that was becoming more and more vigorous, hotter and more dazzling. Fortunately, this was within the mysterious power. Otherwise, in a normal world, even a perfect world, such a change in aura alone would probably be enough to shake the world, causing the laws of heaven and earth to change in accordance with his worldview. In the end, most living beings in this world would be wiped out. At this time, Luo Fan's mind seemed to gradually wake up from a hazy state. Every time his mind moved, it was as if a heavy curtain of darkness had been torn open, allowing him to breathe a little more fresh air. It was as if his mind had ascended to a higher level. All of a sudden, a strong sense of danger descended from the sky, directly attacking his mind. This sense of crisis was so strong that it even made him suspect that the concept of his own existence would be completely erased in the next moment. Under this strong sense of crisis, he instantly struggled and suddenly completely woke up from the state of confusion. As he completely woke up, the strong aura on his body that could not be suppressed before was completely retracted. In an instant, it was as if nothing had appeared, allowing the inside of this power to return to its original calmness. This is the feeling of the fourth major tribulation? At this moment, he, who had woken up, already understood where the strong sense of crisis came from. In his senses, his fourth major tribulation, which could only be vaguely sensed, had now appeared extremely clearly. His fourth major tribulation would arrive in his own time, which was 1,835,370,000 years later. And this major tribulation was countless times more terrifying than the third major tribulation that he had sensed back then. He even had a feeling that if he continued to develop normally, then when the fourth great tribulation descended, he would die a graveless death under that great tribulation. It was this strong sense that made him feel a strong sense of crisis, as if he was going to be erased in the next moment. It was also this strong sense that instantly woke him up from the comfortable process of turning around. It's actually such a terrifying major tribulation. It hasn't been long since I went through the third major tribulation. Luo Fan felt both happy and sad at the same time. He was happy because he had sensed the specific time of the major tribulation, but he was also shocked by the terror of the fourth major tribulation. Just as Luo Fan's expression changed from the terror of the fourth major tribulation, the mysterious power produced an indescribable fluctuation. Amidst the fluctuation, Sky Lady, who was in a different timeline, gradually materialized and appeared in the power. She had used the power to break free from a certain world or a certain chaotic planet. Compared to back then, the current her was already a little stronger, and the presence she exuded was clearly a little stronger than back then. It was only 120 million years, but she had already made such progress. The strength of the foundation that she had built when she recultivated back then was self-evident. At the same time, it was imaginable how mysterious her encounters over the years were. "You're awake?" The moment she saw Luo Fan, Sky Lady, who was in a different timeline, was stunned at first, but then she smiled and said. But soon, she noticed that there was something wrong with Luo Fan's expression, and she could not help but be shocked. Chapter 1976. Luo Fan did not try to hide his thoughts at this moment. He just said plainly, "I just discovered some crises that are hard to resist for the time being. It's not about anything else." Upon hearing this, the empty lady in the alternate timeline felt relieved. Then, she felt an inexplicable feeling of sympathy for the death of a rabbit. After all, Luo Fan could be said to be the most powerful existence she had ever seen apart from true saints. Now, even such an existence was facing an insurmountable crisis. Was there really no peaceful time for cultivation? Could it be that she would also encounter such a terrifying crisis in the future? What came after that was her worry for Luo Fan. From this, one could see the difference between closeness and distance between them. Luo Fan naturally saw the change in Space Maiden's emotions in the alternate timeline. However, he did not take it to heart. After all, he understood this mentality quite well. Moreover, he believed that if it was him, it would probably be similar. At this moment, the empty lady in the alternate timeline asked, "So, what are you going to do?" Luo Fan looked up at the endless starry sky in front of him. Suddenly, an inexplicable smile appeared on his face. He said, "Of course, I'm going to find a way out when there's no way out." The empty lady in the alternate timeline looked in the direction that Luo Fan was pointing at. She found that it was just a void. There was no heaven or earth, nor was there any chaos planet. She could not help but become more curious. She did not know what the way out was that Luo Fan was pointing at. However, she did not have the perspective that Luo Fan currently had. Without this concept, she did not know how vast and incredible the world was outside the area that was enveloped by the power. However, although she could not see those and could not figure out how Luo Fan was going to find the way out, she knew in her heart that after this time, she was afraid that she would be completely separated from Luo Fan. The chances of them meeting again in the future were quite slim. Knowing this, she could not help but feel an inexplicable reluctance in her heart. This was naturally not because she had developed feelings for Luo Fan between a man and a woman, but because, to her, Luo Fan was a true mentor and helpful friend. The reason why she was able to make such great progress in such a short time and even rebuild her cultivation foundation was all because of Luo Fan. She could imagine that without Luo Fan, even if she had made some progress, she would not have been able to do so. That improvement was absolutely insignificant. With this understanding, how could she not feel reluctant to part with Luo Fan? "You're leaving," she sighed. "Of course, the way out is not something that can be found just by waiting here." Luo Fan just smiled. He did not know if it was an illusion, but his body seemed to gradually become illusory, gradually turning into an indescribable state. Under an inexplicable impulse, the air lady in the alternate timeline suddenly said, "Can you take me with you?" Luo Fan was slightly stunned, and the feeling of becoming illusory disappeared in an instant. Then, he showed an indifferent expression and said, "This should not be a decision made on impulse, so I will pretend that I did not hear your request." Hearing this, the air lady in the alternate timeline sighed and did not continue to insist. She knew that the request she made just now was indeed just an impulsive one. For her, she was currently within the range of this power. Traveling among the numerous fragments of the world was the best way for her to cultivate, not only because the countless fragments of the world contained countless mysteries that could enlighten her, but also because she had become different in the eyes of the world because of her previous efforts. She had become the cultivator that the worlds will paid attention to. Under such circumstances, it was extremely easy for her to obtain benefits from the world's will. In the future, under the repeated tribulations of the world, she would also be able to obtain more opportunities to perform. In the end, through this performance, she would obtain benefits again and again. In the end, she would break through the limits and achieve a height that she could not even imagine. In comparison, leaving this fragment of the world and finding a way out was not a problem. Even if she found it, the cultivation environment might not be as good as cultivating in this fragment of the world. Under such circumstances, choosing to leave was obviously not a wise choice. Even Luo Fan, if it wasn't for the terrifying fourth tribulation, he wouldn't have left this fragment of the great heaven and earth so easily. After a while, the air lady in the alternate timeline said, "I'll ask Hun Ku to come and meet you." Luo Fan heard this and shook his head. He said, "If it's fated, she will naturally appear before I leave. However, if it's not fated, even if I ask her to come, it will only add to my troubles." Hearing this, the air lady in the alternate timeline frowned and said, "How cruel." Luo Fan just smiled bitterly and did not answer. The more he cultivated and the more he improved, the more he felt that there was an indescribable mysterious existence above the heaven and earth, above the chaotic plane. It was controlling everything and arranging the fate of all living beings, even if it was the fate of a true sage. As for the feeling that he had broken away from the control of heaven and earth and the control of opportunity when he was still in the sage-to-be realm, at this moment, it was just a kind of self-inflated ego of a frog at the bottom of a well who had just jumped up a few steps and saw a bigger well. It was precisely because of this that he was even more in awe of that fate and said such words at this moment. The air lady in the alternate timeline also revered fate. If Luo Fan did not say anything, she would naturally go and ask Hun Ku to come over according to her wishes. However, since Luo Fan had already said so, she naturally had nothing to say. She just stood there quietly and waited. At this moment, Luo Fan's eyes were fixed on a certain big world within the range of the power. That big world was neither the Great Tianyuan world nor the Great Jili world. It was a big world not far away, the one closest to this position. The reason why he chose that big world was very simple. It was because that big world had an indescribable connection with the many perfect worlds around it, including the earth, the universe, and the untainted land. This connection made the big world not so repelled by the aura of the other worlds. This situation clearly represented a fact. That was, it was very likely that the big world would not react too strongly to his entry. It should be known that it was a big world that might have a large number of true sages. Among such existences, a cultivator like him, who had gone through 3 major tribulations, could at most be regarded as an upper-class existence. He could not even be regarded as the best. Apart from the hundreds or even thousands of true sages, there might be many existences that were not true sages. There might also be many existences that were not true sages. In such a big world, if he was repelled by it, the consequences that awaited him could be imagined. Of course, everything about that big world was just speculation. Was the connection between that big world and these perfect worlds really like this? If that was the case, would it really not repel him? If it did not repel him, would he really be able to establish himself in that big world? And so on and so forth. Everything was still unknown. If Luo Fan had a choice, he would definitely try his best to understand that big world as much as possible. After confirming all these speculations, he would decide whether to enter it or not. However, under the pressure of the 4th major tribulation, even if he knew that this situation was quite hasty and dangerous, he had no choice but to do so. At that moment, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. The perspective in his eyes started to change slightly. The originally empty area suddenly had countless networks. These networks were densely packed. They wrapped the countless stars within them. Even the illusory star that he was currently on, this mysterious power, was also a node of the network. These networks were none other than the transportation network that existed in the entire chaotic state. That was right. It was the transportation network that many true sages had opened up little by little to connect the many perfect worlds and the big world. The reason why it appeared now and not before was because Luo Fan's own thinking and perspective had changed. From the various performances of the light and shadow refracted by this power, all the images displayed by this power were completely displayed according to Luo Fan's understanding. That is to say, only what Luo Fan thought existed in his mind would exist in you. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan did not think about whether the transportation network existed or not. In this way, the chaotic scene reflected by the power naturally only included the countless great worlds, perfect worlds, and did not include the numerous transportation networks. Along with the appearance of the transportation network, the scenery outside the transportation network had already turned into a boundless abyss. Vaguely, there seemed to be countless sinister lights flickering. It was as if there was an endless world and space around the network. That was the negative emotion universe. It was also the kind of place where once living beings fell into it, they would never be able to reincarnate. This was the chaos outlook that Luo Fan had obtained from a living being in another perfect world. It seems that there are many living beings in the chaotic state. Such a thought instantly flashed across Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, a faintly discernible mist appeared in the void around the endless network. The fog surged slightly, constantly changing and improving. It vaguely seemed to be condensing something, but it seemed to be unable to condense it. This situation made Luo Fan realize in his heart that the light and shadow refracted by this power was not really a result of a change in his thoughts. It must be based on the understanding of the things that he thought existed in the depths of his heart. In other words, only when he had a corresponding understanding of what he wanted to see could he change his mind and make it appear under the refraction of this power. Not to mention anything else, everything that appeared in the starry sky was something that Luo Fan already had a rather deep understanding of. There was naturally no need to mention the perfect world. Currently, Luo Fan could not even count the number of perfect worlds that he had experienced with one hand. Under such circumstances, his understanding of the perfect world was naturally very deep. As for the real world, although there were fewer of them, there were doppelgangers in it after all. Under such circumstances, he naturally had a considerable understanding of the real world. With these two kinds of understandings as a foundation, he could see the real world and the perfect world through the refraction of this power. Naturally, it was a matter of course. As for the transportation network, not only did he obtain the information from the cultivator from another perfect heaven and earth, but he had also personally walked on this path with Emptiness Maiden and Hun Ku from another timeline, so he understood it very well. Of course, it was already deep enough. In this case, he could naturally see the existence of that path by changing his mind. In addition to this, there was the universe of negative emotions around the path. When he encountered the primordial origin spiritual treasure fragment several times, his mind was brought into it. Was there a need to say more about his deep understanding of it? All of these were positive signs. In that case, his understanding of the chaotic creatures was a negative example. Although Luo Fan had already caught a primal chaos snake and even flipped through its memories, because the primal chaos snake lived in a state of chaos, his reading of its memories was extremely one-sided. He couldn't even understand how it lived in a state of chaos. He didn't even know what it looked like. Under such circumstances, how could he say that he had a clear understanding of the chaotic creatures? Because of this one-sidedness, this lack of understanding naturally led to this result. Although he could vaguely discover that there were a large number of creatures in the chaos outside the transportation network, he could only see the fog. As for the specific appearance and the specific location, he had no idea at all. I'm afraid this is only 1/1000th of the state of chaos. It's even 1/1000th of the scene. Looking at the extremely complicated void in front of him, such a thought suddenly flashed across Luo Fan's mind. As far as he knew, there were so many things in the state of chaos. Although it seemed quite complicated, it was obviously just an extremely tiny part of the things in the state of chaos. It might not even be the tip of the iceberg. Behind it, in the deeper place, there were still more and more profound mysteries. In other words, there were more unbelievable scenes. With this thought, he once again felt an indescribable reverence for the chaos and the reverence for cultivation. Once again, he clearly realized how insignificant he was. Just when Luo Fan was about to move towards the vast world that he had locked on to, all of a sudden, this bizarre force fluctuated inexplicably. Then, a figure gradually materialized in this force and appeared not far from Space Maiden in the alternate timeline. It seems that we're fated after all. Space Maiden in the alternate timeline smiled all of a sudden. The figure that appeared was naturally Hun Ku. Hun Ku had a sudden impulse to come here to take a look, but she didn't expect to see such a scene when she arrived. Her mother stood quietly at the side, while her father's figure gradually became illusory, as if he was about to disappear completely. She could not help but cry out in shock, "Dad, where are you going?" Luo Fan came back to his senses and sighed. This was the second time he had left this force, and his journey to the vast world was interrupted. His figure gradually returned to its original form. He turned around and said, "I didn't expect you to make it at the last moment. It seems that I have to leave something behind after all." Hearing that, the Space Maiden's eyes lit up, and there was an indescribable joy in her eyes. Hunku did not think too much at this moment. She only said, "Dad, where are you going? Are you never coming back? I'm facing a great crisis now. I have to leave this place to find a way to deal with it. It's not good for me to stay here." Luo Fan just smiled and said. He did not hide his predicament at all. There was no need to hide it either. Crisis? What crisis? If I can be of use, I'm willing to use everything I have to help you get through this crisis, Hunku said directly. Luo Fan just smiled and said, "Only I can deal with this crisis. Others, including you guys, can't help me at all. However, you don't have to worry. Since there is danger, there will naturally be opportunities. I can definitely get through it. Alright, let's not talk about this. Since you can catch up with me at the last moment before I leave, it means that fate has decided that we're fated. So, I'll leave this to you. It's up to you what kind of opportunities you can get from here." As he said this, Luo Fan's heart moved. The strange force had a subtle fluctuation. Along with this fluctuation, Space Maiden and Hunku, who were in the alternate timeline, felt an indescribable change in their perspective. In the blink of an eye, the sparse light and shadow of the starry sky began to gradually transform into a completely different appearance. Stars gradually appeared. Among the stars, there was even a transportation network connecting the many stars. Chapter 1977. In the eyes of Space Maiden and Hunku, who were in different timelines, the number of worlds they saw had expanded to an unbelievable level. It had even reached a point where they could not believe it. However, Luo Fan clearly knew that the number of worlds they saw was only a millionth of his. Although the number had already reached an unimaginable level, the limitations were still too great. Under such limitations, they could not even establish a true concept of the vastness of the entire chaotic state. Although Luo Fan recognized their limitations, he could not think of anything else. After all, being able to expand their perspective through his own concept and see so many worlds that they could not see before was already the limit of what Luo Fan could do. If he wanted to take another step forward, it was already not a realm that he could reach now. Therefore, after doing all this, he just smiled faintly and no longer cared about what they were thinking. His figure gradually became blurry, and he gradually moved towards the vast world that he had already locked onto. The mysteriousness of this power was beyond imagination, and it faintly showed signs of transcending the traffic network. Under Luo Fan's control, there was naturally an illusory path that directly connected this platform to that side of the world. The moment this illusory path was established, Luo Fan felt as if he had received a pushing force that was enough to crush him. He was instantly thrown out of that force and rushed towards the vast world at an incomparably fast speed. In just a flash, he could no longer see the true appearance of that power when he turned his head. He could only vaguely see a faintly discernible illusory star behind him, and in another flash, even this faintly discernible feeling had completely disappeared. Advancing on this illusory path, there was no concept of time at all. Even his own perception of time had been distorted. At this moment, it was only then that Luo Fan truly realized how fragile his own space-time dimension was, even if he had been blessed with the world view of laws, which had completely changed its appearance and was many times stronger than the normal space-time dimension. At this time, he was unable to maintain his unique space-time dimension. His sense of time was distorted by the illusory path's perception of space-time that completely ignored it. After advancing for an unknown period of time, a gigantic existence pounced on him, making him feel as if he had smashed into a huge rock. It smashed onto the gigantic existence. Then, an indescribable pain came from all directions to attack him. In the blink of an eye, he felt that his body had completely collapsed. Even his soul and his life source had been completely crushed by this terrifying power. Fortunately, this power was obviously just a natural reaction and was not completely targeted at him. Therefore, although everything that existed had been completely shattered by the impact of this power and turned into nothingness, there was still a huge gap between them. His invisible existence, his concept of existence, was still there. In fact, it wasn't even impacted at all. This made it so that even though he had been damaged to this extent and even his physical existence had completely dissipated, his life still existed and was still unharmed. When the surrounding environment stabilized, his heart stirred. All kinds of information flowed out from his concept of existence and naturally created countless forces out of thin air. Countless substances began to gradually condense. It didn't take long for his body, his divine soul, his law power, and everything else to be completely condensed in just a short breath. He had recovered and appeared out of thin air in an indescribable world. Could it be the primordial world? Could it be the great desolate world? Looking at this world, Luo Fan's expression revealed a rare inexplicable shock. There was no other reason. Although everything in this world was different from the primordial world, there was an existence that was extremely similar to the primordial world. This extremely similar feeling told him that this world was extremely similar to the appearance of the primordial world after countless years of development and finally upgraded countless times to become a great world. In other words, from this world, he could almost see the appearance of the primordial world after it had passed through 9 great tribulations. This kind of situation was simply subverting his worldview, making him feel like he was in a dream for a moment. However, he quickly snapped out of his daze. Although the situation in this world was unimaginably strange, he was even more confident in himself. He clearly remembered which world he had come to, and he was completely sure that the world in front of him was definitely the world that had an inexplicable connection with Earth, the universe, and the primordial world. It seems that the connection between this world, Earth, the universe, and the primordial world is even closer than I thought. Such a thought flashed through his mind. The area he was currently in was above a deep pool. This deep pool was in the middle of a group of mountains, and it looked like a barren land. All kinds of miasma filled the surroundings of the deep pool, and under the miasma was a large primitive forest. There were also all kinds of extremely powerful creatures in the primitive forest. Luo Fan even sensed the existence of a creature similar to a sage-to-be. Compared to the current Luo Fan, a sage-to-be was only at the level of an ant. It was not a powerful existence, and if it appeared in other places, it would not be enough to make Luo Fan change his expression. However, don't forget that this was just a barren land. The place where the sage-to-be appeared was in a forest covered by miasma. In such an environment, the appearance of such an immortal sage-to-be was self-evident what it meant. This is indeed a great world. I can actually find such a powerful creature in this place. Luo Fan sighed inwardly. It was night time, and the stars in the sky were twinkling. One by one, they were like eyes blinking at him. The calm surface of the deep pool reflected the stars in the sky, facing the twinkling eyes from afar. Luo Fan raised his eyes and glanced at the stars, but he did not pay much attention to them. He just felt that the stars were a little familiar, but he still felt that it was only because this great world was related to the untainted land. However, he soon felt that something was wrong. It was the structure of the stars. It was not similar to the Earth, the universe, or the untainted land. Thinking of this, he was secretly shocked. He turned his head and continued to stare at the sky above, carefully staring at the stars. In his observation, the stars became clearer and clearer, and the various scenes in them began to change slightly. Not long after, his eyes widened in disbelief. This is actually a scene from the primal chaos. Each star is a perfect heaven and earth or a great heaven and earth. At this time, he finally understood why the starry sky in front of him looked so familiar. This part of the starry sky was the starry sky he had seen from the platform formed by the power. However, because of the change in angle, he could not recognize it immediately. He just felt that it was a little familiar with this understanding. He looked at the starry sky again and quickly recognized the location of the Earth and the universe. He also recognized the location of the untainted land. It was so much so that he had even found the illusory star that no longer appeared in the starry sky, which was also the location of the mysterious power. So the starry sky of the universe is like this. In that case, I have actually seen part of the true appearance of the chaos before? At this moment, Luo Fan's heart was filled with an inexplicable bitterness. This bitterness did not come from anything else, but from realizing that he had been blind for so long. In the great heaven primordial world, his doppelgangers could see the countless stars and the many perfect worlds in the chaos at all times. Many worlds. However, he had always felt that it was just an ordinary star, just like the starry sky of a perfect world. He had never thought of exploring it or studying it. Who knew how many opportunities he had missed out on this time? The creatures born in the great Tianyuan world are really blessed. Luo Fan sighed. In order to obtain his current perspective, in order to see the truth of a part of the chaotic state, he had spent countless billions of trillions of years cultivating. In the end, he was only able to obtain this perspective by relying on opportunities that ordinary cultivators could not imagine. However, the creatures in the great Tianyuan world did not need to do so. They were only born and could obtain such a perspective as soon as they looked up. In this way, they were born with a higher level of perspective than the creatures in the perfect Tianyuan world. They could obtain a higher level of understanding than the creatures in the perfect Tianyuan world. In this way, after stepping onto the path of cultivation, once they understood the wonders of the world, they would be able to easily accomplish the results that Luo Fan had spent millions and millions of years of hard work on. This alone has reduced the difficulty of them becoming a true sage by at least 100 times. Sighing inwardly, Luo Fan slowly calmed his mind and collected his scattered thoughts. Then, he began to observe and comprehend the spacetime around him, as well as the rules and principles. This great Tianyuan world was much more stable than any of the perfect Tianyuan world. Even space was much more stable. Moreover, it was far more stable than Luo Fan had imagined. In comparison, although the Yuan Qi that filled the void was much denser, it was not exaggerated and was still within the scope of understanding. As for the rules and principles, with Luo Fan's current strength, although he could sense them, their complexity and mysteriousness made him feel dizzy just by looking at them. That kind of experience was just like a baby seeing the incomparably complex calculus. As for the laws behind the laws, even with Luo Fan's current ability, he could not see them, let alone enter them to comprehend the mysteries of the Great Way. At this time, Luo Fan heard a silhouette coming from afar. He could faintly hear someone shouting, "Just now, there was something falling from the sky. It must be an extraterrestrial spiritual treasure. Hurry up, or else it will be too late." That's right. I just saw the people from the Spirit Treasure sect set off. If we're too late, it will be too late. The Spirit Treasure sect, humph, we can't let them get ahead of us this time. Every time something falls from the sky, it's an opportunity given to us by the sage. How can we let the people from the Spirit Treasure sect get ahead of us every time? Our fighting sect is ranked 3rd among the top 10 sections. The Spirit Treasure sect is only ranked 5th. Now they're relying on their special cultivation methods to steal our opportunities. How can we tolerate this? The language used in these shouts was a language that Luo Fan was quite familiar with. It was a language that he had received from Pangu's primordial spirit. It was a language that only Pangu used. This inexplicable familiarity made Luo Fan have more guesses about the relationship between this world and the primordial world. However, this was obviously not the time to guess about this. There were not only many living beings coming from all over, but their strength was also extremely shocking. Moreover, their strength was extremely shocking. Even the weakest had the strength of a false saint, and the strongest had even reached the level of a supreme emperor. Although such a large number of existences was nothing to Luo Fan, the meaning behind it was extremely terrifying. At this time, what Luo Fan needed to do was obviously to hide and nothing else. Moving slightly, Luo Fan used his powerful law power to directly eliminate all his aura and traces of his existence. He immediately eliminated all traces of his aura and existence, and with a flash, he had already hidden himself in the forest at the side. In the blink of an eye, he had already arrived in front of the sage-to-be in the depths of the Miasma Mountain forest. This sage-to-be was a python. Although it had the strength of a sage-to-be, it had not transformed at all, and even its intelligence seemed to be ordinary. At this moment, it was sleeping on an ancient tree that was unknown how many tens of thousands of years old. It was unknown. At this time, even the traces of Luo Fan's existence had been eliminated. How could the python discover him here? At this time, the python did not move at all. Even its breathing was as even as before. With a thought, Luo Fan pointed at the python. All the python's memories flashed in front of his eyes like illusions, allowing him to understand all the python's experiences in the blink of an eye. His understanding of this world. And unknowingly, he had also learned a lot. Although the python had the strength of a sage-to-be, in this world, it could only be regarded as a creature that could barely occupy a small territory. Compared to the entire world, it was not enough at all. Not to mention the entire world, there were already countless powerful beasts that were hundreds or even thousands of times more powerful than it around this area, threatening it. It was precisely because it was so weak in this world that this creature almost never left this area. Although its memories contained tens of millions of years in time, it was limited to a radius of a few 100,000 miles in space. This area with a radius of hundreds of thousands of miles was the territory of a true sage called Shangjin Dao Lord. There were 3,000 sects under Shangjin Dao Master. Among these 3,000 sects, there were various rankings, such as the righteous path, the unorthodox path, and the outer path. As for the Lingbao sect and the Battle Law sect that Luo Fan had heard about, they were part of the righteous path and were also 2 of the 10 major sects. In the python's memories, almost 99% of the sects under Shangjin Dao Master were under the righteous path. The rest of the insignificant legends involved things other than the Shangjin Dao Lord. However, because it was too far away, these legends were all specious and it was impossible to determine whether they were true or not. According to the legends that the python knew, there seemed to be 3,000 Dao Masters in this world. Each of these 3,000 Dao Masters controlled lands that spanned hundreds of millions of light-years. There were countless sects and experts under their command. Each Dao Master could be said to be a civilization. It was said that there was a demon emperor who was the friendliest to the demons. It could be said that he taught all kinds of people without discrimination. If pythons like them could live in the territory of the demon emperor, they would be given the greatest freedom and the best resources. Moreover, there would be all kinds of methods that would allow the demons to cultivate supreme divine sense, and even to prove their Dao and become saints, and it was said that there was a Dao Master called Dao Master who was extremely repulsed by monsters. Once the many forces under him encountered monsters, they would not hesitate to kill them. Within his territory, there was not even the slightest bit of intelligence from non-human creatures. This was the territory of the 2 Dao Masters that the python was most looking forward to and afraid of. It could even be said that because these 2 Dao Masters meant so much to it, it had such a deep memory of them. It was also why it could let Luo Fan know that there were 2 true saints in this world, 3,000 true saints. Is this really possible? Luo Fan only had doubts at this time. 3,000 true sages. This number was several times more than the 800 sages of the great Tianyuan world. Although he was experienced and knowledgeable, and knew that the cultivation environment of the great Tianyuan world was far superior to any other perfect world, and that the possibility of living beings becoming sages was much higher than in other perfect worlds, he still found it somewhat unbelievable. Chapter 1978. Although Luo Fan had already sensed the arrival of those cultivators from afar, and even clearly heard the conversation between them, that was only because he was powerful. It did not mean that those cultivators were close to this location. In fact, by the time Luo Fan had read through the python's memories and had a general understanding of the area, those cultivators had still not arrived at the miasma forest. Through the python's memories, Luo Fan already knew that the most suitable place for him in the territory of the High Truth Tao Lord was a place called the Chaotic Region. The area that the High Truth Tao Lord controlled spanned hundreds of millions of light-years and was divided into tens of thousands of continents. The structure of the various forces in these continents was naturally extremely complicated. Even if they were all under the command of the High Truth Tao Lord, this complexity could not be changed. After all, every living being had their own selfish motives. Every living being had their own standpoint. Under such circumstances, different forces, even if they belonged to the same large organization, would still have all sorts of dispute. Some of them might even fight to the death. This was not difficult to understand. It was just like how in a world there would definitely be all kinds of living beings, righteous, evil, and other camp. Obviously, for the High Truth Tao Lord, such a large territory, so many forces, and so many living beings were not much different from any other world. Under such circumstances, what was there to be surprised about the emergence of all kinds of different forces and all kinds of hostile camp? In the process of continuous fighting between different forces and opposing camps, it was only natural that the chaotic region that could not be perfectly divided would appear. According to the Python's knowledge, the number of chaotic region under the High Truth Tao Lord was quite large. Relatively speaking, it seemed that the High Truth Tao Lord was not a small force and had a certain right to speak. At this moment, Luo Fan's target was the one closest to the chaotic region. With a slight thought, Luo Fan's figure disappeared into the void. Using the fluctuations of the void, he made use of the various changes of the nomological laws to leave the forest that was about to fall into chaos. With the help of the various changes of the rules, he silently and quickly distanced himself from the forest that was about to fall into turmoil. Only an existence like him, who had completely condensed his own worldview and whose self-awareness had reached an unshakable level, could achieve this in such a short period of time after stepping into this world. If it was any other living being, they would have spent countless years just to adapt to the laws of this world. Not to mention being able to fuse with the laws and borrow their power to move quickly, it was even possible that there would be all sorts of light and shadows on his body at all times, like a huge torch calling out to all living beings. Just a few dozen breaths after Luo Fan left the forest exploded. Terrifying shockwaves erupted from the forest and rolled out in all directions. The scene was incomparably violent. It was incomparably tragic. As for the python whose memory had been read by Luo Fan, it was directly pulled out under this explosion. It kept struggling in the air and asked, "Which master is joking with me?" Along with figures appeared in the void one after another, watching the python. Just as Luo Fan had sensed, these figures were all at least false sage cultivators. They appeared in the void one after another, and the aura they emitted seemed to have made the surrounding time and space seem to have become much quieter. "Who passed by here just now and took away our treasure?" a cultivator shouted. The python did not know this. At this moment it cried out helplessly, "No, I didn't feel anyone pass by," such words. No one would believe it. To these cultivators, only existences from major sects could treat them as equals. Even if they were cultivators who had taken human form, they would only be of a low-level race. Moreover, this python in front of them didn't even know how to shapeshift. In their eyes, its strength was so weak that it couldn't even be considered as an ant. Under such circumstances, how could they possibly believe the words of this python? In an instant, the python let out an incomparably mournful scream. Amidst the scream, its body suddenly collapsed, and its soul was directly pulled out. Countless rapidly changing lights and shadows were projected from it, and countless strange sounds that were condensed in one place sounded obviously. Its memory was being roughly read in the end. After many cultivators finished reading its memories, the python's soul could no longer maintain its integrity. It suddenly collapsed, turning into specks of light and completely disappearing. At this moment, there were already several times more cultivators gathered here than at the beginning. They surrounded this place, and all of them were indignant. It seems that some powerhouses have taken it first. This trash is too weak. He can't discover anything unusual at all. The one who spoke was a cultivator from the Do-Law sect. At this moment, a cultivator who had arrived later chuckled and said, "It seems that your Do-Law sect won't be able to make a comeback this time." As he spoke, the surrounding cultivators all laughed out loud, feeling extremely proud of themselves. This kind of performance caused the expressions of the cultivators from the Do-Law sect to become even uglier. To them, the value of the treasure that fell from the sky was nothing. After all, there would be treasures that fell from the sky every few years, and there would not be many truly valuable treasures. The treasure just now might not have much value. Not to mention, there were so many people here. Even if the treasure was extremely valuable, how much would it be if it was divided among them? Therefore, to them, in reality, they did not care too much about the value of the treasure itself. What they cared about was their face in front of the Spirit Treasure sect. No matter how valuable the treasure was, as long as they could obtain it in front of the Spirit Treasure sect, then they would have face. However, no matter how bad the treasure was, as long as they could not obtain it in front of the Spirit Treasure sect, then they would lose face and fail. Under such circumstances, to be ridiculed by a Spirit Treasure sect cultivator like this, that kind of feeling, naturally, there was no need to say anything more. Don't be too proud. So what if you have more treasures? If you are not strong enough, you will not be able to transcend. The position of the Do-Law sect in front of the Spirit Treasure sect is higher than that of the Spirit Treasure sect. A cultivator said coldly. This made the cultivator from the Spirit Treasure sect a little unhappy. This is only temporary. There is less than 100,000 years until the next ranking conference. At that time, we will definitely be able to suppress the Do-Law sect and let you know that cultivators are cultivators. We are not monsters because we know how to use tools. After the two sides quarreled, they parted on bad terms. After the battle sect's disciples left, a cultivator said, "I feel like something is wrong. This place is so close to our sect. This place is so close to our sect, and we rushed over as soon as we felt something was wrong. Could it be that someone could take the treasure before us? There are crouching tigers and hidden dragons in this world. Although we are one of the top 10 sects and are considered strong, there are still many who are stronger than us. Perhaps a lone cultivator can easily crush our entire sect. Now that we have met one or two experts who are fast and just happen to be nearby, it is not inconceivable." Another cultivator said indifferently. Hearing this, the previous cultivator still didn't quite believe it. "I still feel that something is wrong. Don't think too much. Although I feel bad about losing face in front of the Spirit Treasure sect, cultivation is like this. We can't always have everything going our way. There will always be setbacks." Hearing this, the cultivator who felt that something was wrong could only nod and say no more. However, what he was thinking in his heart was not something that others could know. The cultivator who was advising knew that he had reached his limit. He couldn't say anything more to completely change a person's mind. At that moment, he didn't say anything more and let the cultivator think on his own. Their conversation wasn't too secretive, and it was just a normal way of communicating with each other. But it was like this. No one dared to eavesdrop. Except for Luo Fan, although Luo Fan had already flown tens of thousands of miles away from this position, because this position was what he was paying attention to, and he had stayed here for a period of time. He was using some kind of extremely mysterious listening method to sense the various changes in the void. Then, through the changes in the void, he deduced everything that they were talking about. He also heard the conversation between the cultivators of the Fighting Law sect, who felt that something was wrong, and those who felt that it was normal. It seems that the problem of my identity should have been solved. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. As for the cultivator's figure, it was completely the appearance of the primordial world's connate Taoism body. In other words, he was no longer surprised by his current appearance. Even the Earth universe and the primordial world's connate Taoism body could be so similar. What was so surprising about the appearance of the connate Taoism body in front of him, which looked like the scene after the primordial world's ninth tribulation of heaven and earth? Of course, he vaguely understood that this kind of concealment would only work on those who were below the true divine level, which was below the Tao Master level. For the true divine, which was also the Tao Master level of this vast world, this kind of concealment might just be a joke. Maybe at this time, some Tao Masters were looking down at him from a very high level. However, even though he knew this, his mood wasn't affected much. He was quite clear that he was currently considered powerful compared to the creatures below the true divine level, but in the eyes of the true divine, he was just an ant. If he had offended a true saint, the true saint might have casually killed him. However, if he had not angered the true saint would not have paid too much attention to him. It was like a person to an ant. Unless the ant crawled on your feet and made you feel itchy, why would you pay attention to it? This kind of understanding was discouraging, but also reassuring. The place where Luo Fan landed was billions of miles away from the chaotic area. On the way, he had to pass through the territories of tens of thousands of experts. Among these experts, almost all of them were weaker than Luo Fan. However, the strongest expert had even reached the Supreme Emperor level. Even if he faced Luo Fan, he might be able to resist a little. As for the various traps, restrictions, and defenses that were set up in the void, there were countless of them. Even Luo Fan couldn't help but be moved by the mysteriousness of it. If it weren't for the fact that he clearly understood how small he was compared to this world, he would have been extremely cautious along the way and tried his best to eliminate hidden worries. He might have fallen into a trap in the first 1/10 of the journey, and a battle with the owners of those territories would break out. After witnessing this kind of exquisite and inexplicably obscure arrangement, Luo Fan had an even stronger expectation towards the cultivation world of this side of the world. However, he was still able to sense the existence of the fourth tribulation. Luo Fan was not a weakling in this world. Although there were some twists and turns along the way, he eventually arrived at the chaotic area safely. When he stepped into the chaotic area, Luo Fan knew that he had arrived at the most suitable place for him. Compared to other areas that seemed orderly, but in reality, almost all power and rules were controlled by some kind of existence and could not be used or touched at will, the chaotic area was the complete opposite. On the surface, it looked extremely chaotic. There seemed to be no order at all, and it was completely filled with weak experts. However, whether it was power or rules, they had freedom that was not available in the outside world. In other words, as long as one had enough strength, no matter who they were or what their background was, they could seize the territory and power that they wanted at will. Even the rules that they wanted. Such a place was naturally hell for cultivators with backgrounds and powers to rely on in this world. They did not even dare to go near it. However, for a cultivator like Luo Fan who only had strength but no background, it could not be better. He believed that as long as he sneaked into the chaotic area for a while, no one would care that he was an outsider. On the surface, the chaotic area did not look much different from the outside world. It was the same kind of incomparably beautiful natural scenery, and there were also all kinds of exquisite and indescribable wonders that showed to all living beings in the world some kind of indescribable mystery. Only the creatures that lived behind the scenery, which were much more powerful than those in the outside world, would let people know that this was not a paradise. When Luo Fan's figure appeared in the chaotic area, countless senses from all over the world spread towards him, and in the blink of an eye, he did not know how many times they had scanned him. In the end, when Luo Fan frowned slightly and sensed for a while, he retreated like a stray dog. As these senses retreated, no living beings dared to release their senses towards Luo Fan. Even ordinary living beings began to avoid him at this time, not daring to approach him. There were also territories in the disordered zone, just like how each Tao master had his own territory and his own forces. These forces occupied the best cultivation environment in the chaotic area, built cities in the most wonderful places, and even formed alliances. The chaotic area that Luo Fan had chosen was hundreds of light years wide. There were as many forces here as the stars in the sky. The area that Luo Fan had entered was controlled by a force called Hungry Wolf City. The best cultivation place in this territory was the city called Hungry Wolf City. The owner of this city was a powerhouse whose strength had reached the false sage stage. Under him was an army of millions of cultivators. It was said that there were a large number of false sages and quasi-sages among them, and there were countless cultivators below that. Any cultivator could enter this area, but if any cultivator wanted to enter Hungry Wolf City, they would have to pay tribute to the owner of Hungry Wolf City. For the situation in this area, Luo Fan only needed to inquire a little, and he already knew it clearly. In reality, the true powerhouses in this area had all entered Hungry Wolf City. Not only was it because the cultivation environment in Hungry Wolf City was better, but it was also because the owner of Hungry Wolf City would come out from time to challenge those powerhouses. Once a powerhouse could not resist his challenge, he would be completely torn apart and devoured. Only by joining Hungry Wolf City could one avoid the challenge of the City Lord. Only then would he be able to avoid the City Lord's challenge and obtain the opportunity to cultivate in peace in this region. At that time, the Khanate Grand Heavenly Realm cultivator who had explained this to Luo Fan looked at Luo Fan with admiration and pity. Khanate Grand Heavenly Realm cultivators like them were not worthy of the Hungry Wolf City Lord's attention, so they were relatively safe. In comparison, although Luo Fan in front of him couldn't tell how strong or weak he was, and he couldn't tell what level he was at, he could clearly tell that this was a powerhouse that was enough to interest the Hungry Wolf City Lord. As expected of the chaotic area, it seems to have rules, but it's actually the law of the jungle. This was the only thought that flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Chapter 1979. What a Hungry Wolf City. I came to this world to make a breakthrough, so I obviously need to communicate with other cultivators. This Hungry Wolf City might be my starting point. A thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Without any hesitation, he headed straight for Hungry Wolf City. Since the chaotic region was a place where the strong preyed on the weak, there was naturally no need for him to hide his goal, nor did he need to find a reason. Since he had his eyes on Hungry Wolf City, he would naturally fight his way there. Although the world was vast and boundless, and this region was also boundless, it was clearly not an obstacle for Luo Fan. In just a few dozen breaths of time, he had already traversed millions of miles and arrived in front of the magnificent Hungry Wolf City. From afar, Hungry Wolf City looked like a huge wild wolf lying on the ground. Its mouth was wide open, its eyes were flickering with a cold light, and its arched back that looked like it was about to pounce out contained a shocking effect. Anyone who saw it would involuntarily feel an indescribable sense of nervousness. What an exquisite method! Luo Fan could not help but sigh as he looked at Hungry Wolf City. The appearance of this huge wild wolf was clearly not the true appearance of Hungry Wolf City. In reality, the true Hungry Wolf City looked like an ordinary majestic city. However, the appearance of the wild wolf in front of him was a kind of formation that had already reversed reality into illusion. This kind of formation completely changed illusion and reality, causing Hungry Wolf City to seem to be in an illusion, and the scene in the illusion seemed to be real. Through this reversal, even a false saint existence would not be able to break through the defense and harm Hungry Wolf City. After all, any damage that a false saint existence inflicted on it would be turned into an illusion, and it would not be able to truly harm its essence, however. This was only true for pseudo-saint level existences. For an existence like Luo Fan, who had already far surpassed the false saint stage and even surpassed the supreme emperor stage, it was really a simple matter to break through this kind of formation. Wanting to break through this formation was truly a simple matter. With just a thought, he would be able to directly pass through the formation and step into Hungry Wolf City. However, this was not a problem with the formation. It was because of the existence of the formation. In fact, it was only at the level of despair. That's right, the person who set up this formation wasn't the false Saint City Lord of Hungry Wolf City, but an unknown despair. Looks like there's another faction behind the Hungry Wolf City Lord. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he became even more confident in his following plan. Without any hesitation, he passed through the formation and stepped into the illusory domain, arriving at the real Hungry Wolf City. This true Hungry Wolf City was extremely vast, if one were to calculate it in terms of area. It was at least several million kilometers in radius. There were hundreds of millions of cultivators living in the city. Communication, survival, trading, fighting. Luo Fan swept his gaze across. Among the hundreds of millions of cultivators, the stronger ones were even close to the pseudo-sage stage, while the weaker ones were at least itinerant immortals. In other words, living beings who had obtained eternal life. However, such existences, in this Hungry Wolf City, they obviously played the role of an ordinary resident, even though they were already immortal. Although they were already immortals, they had broken free from the shackles of their lifespans. However, in this city, some were even beggars while others were poor. They had to bend their knees for 3 meals a day, and lose all their dignity for a bit of cultivation resources. Those who were slightly better off than these itinerant immortals were the primordial unity pure yang cultivators. However, they were only slightly better off. At the very least, they didn't have to be reduced to beggars or poor people. Instead, they still had legitimate jobs, such as being servants, housekeepers, and so on. Above them were Khanate Grand Luo cultivators. Compared to primordial unity pure yang cultivators, the situation of these Khanate Grand Luo cultivators was slightly better. At the very least, they could do some small businesses. They could barely gain a foothold in this city, and own some property of their own. Only those who were truly at the quasi-saint stage and above could be considered to have status, identity, and dignity in this city. Only experts with various identities and dignity could enjoy the various conveniences of this city and obtain the various resources provided by this city. As for the one who truly wanted to obtain the best of everything, it was obviously the Hungry Wolf City Lord, who stayed in the depths of the city, who was almost at the center. The Hungry Wolf City Lord was a pseudo-sage, and his world was obviously this Hungry Wolf City. Here, the strength that he could unleash was extremely powerful, and it felt like he was not much weaker than a supreme emperor. At this moment, as soon as Luo Fan stepped into Hungry Wolf City, he could already feel the presence that seemed to fill the entire world appearing in the center of Hungry Wolf City. Numerous weaker but equally powerful auras surrounded and protected Hungry Wolf City Lord. They fused with each other to faintly form an extremely powerful and enormous domain that covered the entire city, causing all the living beings in the city to have no choice but to submit to its tyrannical might. At this moment, an imposing aura rushed towards Luo Fan from all directions. Like a sea wolf, it directly stirred up ripples in the space-time around his body. It also caused the laws around his body to produce indescribable fluctuations. The fluctuation was not strong, but it was enough to make Luo Fan's control over the laws lose its effect, causing his originally concealed figure to be revealed. At this moment, a fierce voice entered Luo Fan's ears. "Which expert has come to visit my Hungry Wolf City?" The source of this voice was none other than the incomparably huge presence in the center of Hungry Wolf City, which was the Hungry Wolf City Lord. "In the end, my control over the laws of this world isn't strong enough. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been discovered." At this moment, an inexplicable helplessness appeared on Luo Fan's face. In reality, there were two reasons why he was discovered by the Hungry Wolf City Lord at this time. The first reason, which was also the most important reason, was that the Hungry Wolf City Lord treated this Hungry Wolf City as the foundation for him to become a false saint, allowing him to unleash strength that far surpassed the false saint stage in this Hungry Wolf City. Similarly, he could also possess power that surpassed the false saint stage. The second reason was that the amount of time he had spent in this world was too short. Now, his understanding of the laws of this world was still extremely one-sided. His current understanding of the laws of this world was still extremely one-sided. This understanding made it impossible for him to borrow the laws of the world. It was impossible for it to be perfect. There were still many traces left behind, and he was unable to suppress everything. It was the combination of these two reasons that caused him to be discovered by the Hungry Wolf City Lord at this time. However, since he had already been discovered, Luo Fan could not be bothered to hide himself anymore. His figure was completely revealed, and his powerful law power swept across. He had already completely suppressed the subtle space-time fluctuations and the fluctuations of the laws of the world around him, causing the place where he was to become calm. The powerful aura and pressure produced by the Hungry Wolf City Lord had completely disappeared at this moment. At this moment, the Hungry Wolf City Lord finally felt how powerful this powerhouse that he had suddenly sensed in his own city was. For the first time, he felt that he would not be able to defeat the other party in Hungry Wolf City. With this feeling, he made a prompt decision and changed his original thoughts. In an instant, the entire Hungry Wolf City was mobilized. All kinds of changes in the virtual and real world advanced layer by layer, quickly gathering towards where Luo Fan was from all directions in the city. In just the blink of an eye, Luo Fan felt an incomparably powerful power transforming his body from real to fake. It was going to change his virtual and real state from the same state as the Hungry Wolf City to another state. It might not be completely illusory or real, but it was definitely a state that was fundamentally different from the virtual and real state of the Hungry Wolf City. Facing such a situation, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. If he was still a false saint or even a desperado, he might not be able to resist such a change at all and would be instantly thrown out of the Hungry Wolf City. However, the current him was not that kind of weak existence. The moment it got close to his body trembled. It was naturally flattened. It was as if there was an invisible and tough barrier around his body, blocking all of this. At this moment, the Hungry Wolf City Lord exclaimed, "How is this possible? Which Tao Master are you a disciple of? How could there be such a dimensional protective magic treasure?" At this moment, in the center of the Hungry Wolf City, a huge figure rose from the sky. It floated in the air. This figure was a burly man with strong muscles all over his body. Even at his normal size, he looked extremely intimidating, not to mention that his body was at least tens of thousands of feet tall. That terrifying degree was thousands of times stronger than his normal size. Immediately after, figures appeared out of thin air beside him. These figures were dressed in armor, and their expressions were solemn. They faintly formed an indescribable defensive formation to protect the giant. The giant was the city lord of Hungry Wolf City. His aura had fused with the entire Hungry Wolf City. As they resonated with each other, their powers continued to communicate and circulate, faintly brewing an unimaginably powerful might. The figures around him were obviously the cultivators under him. Their auras were also communicating with the Hungry Wolf City Lord. As they circulated, they formed a different kind of entity, allowing the Hungry Wolf City Lord to obtain a defensive power that was several times stronger than what he had. Luo Fan roughly looked around. There were more than 100,000 figures around the Hungry Wolf City Lord. In this way they formed an astonishing colossus, causing the Hungry Wolf City Lord to look at least 100 times more astonishing than before. At this moment, the Hungry Wolf City Lord's face was filled with shock, disbelief, and even despair. From the looks of it, he had already treated Luo Fan as a disciple of a true saint. Even Luo Fan's method of isolating the impact of the virtual and real transformation with his own unique space-time dimension had been regarded as a kind of dimensional protective magic treasure, which had become a clear proof that he was a disciple of a true sage. Although it was just a sentence and an expression, Luo Fan had already deciphered many things from it. Just like in other worlds, the disciples of a true saint also had an extremely high status in this world, and they also represented absolute experts, the other cultivators who were not disciples of a true saint. Even in this chaotic region, the Hungry Wolf City Lord, who was already considered a powerful existence, did not have the slightest confidence that he could fight against him. Perhaps in their hearts, they only thought that the gap between them and the disciples of a true saint was like the distance between heaven and earth. Usually, it was impossible for them to have any contact. But once there was contact, for them, it obviously meant that fate no longer cared for them, and it meant that their survival had probably already reached the most dangerous moment. Through this expression and a sentence, Luo Fan analyzed all this, but he just smiled. I am not a disciple of a Tao master. These words instantly made the Hungry Wolf City Lord's eyes shine with an indescribable light. A Tao master was a supreme, omnipotent, eternal, and indestructible existence. Such an existence, any disciple of a Tao master would have absolute pride. There was absolutely no disciple of a Tao master who would deny their origin. Perhaps there was no disciple of a Tao master who would dare to deny their origin, for a Tao master. Speaking anywhere in this vast world was like speaking in front of them. Under such circumstances they felt like speaking in front of them. Denying that one was a disciple of a Tao master anywhere was equivalent to denying that one was a disciple of a Tao master in front of that Tao master. In this case, a denial might lead to disaster. Under such circumstances, which disciple of a Tao master would dare to deny their identity? Therefore, it could also be said that anyone who said that they were a disciple of a Tao master might be lying. However, anyone who said that they were not a disciple of a Tao master was absolutely true. So you're not a disciple of a Tao master. Then I can rest assured. The Hungry Wolf City Lord chuckled. The greed in his eyes was now so strong that it almost turned into a substance. It constantly swallowed and spat in the void, constantly stirring up the surrounding laws and laws. It faintly formed a kind of oppression on Luo Fan, rolling towards him. However, this kind of pressure was the same as the effects of the various changes before. It did not approach Luo Fan's body, and completely disappeared not far away, leaving not even a trace. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan secretly thought to himself, as expected. When he denied that he was a disciple of a Tao master, he was already fully aware that such a situation would occur. The reason why the Hungry Wolf City Lord was in despair was because he saw that he had eliminated the Hungry Wolf City Lord's attack with spacetime, so he thought that he had the so-called dimensional protective magic treasure, and thought that he was a disciple of a Tao master. Since that was the case, If he wasn't a disciple of a Tao master, then how could the Hungry Wolf City Lord not be tempted by the dimensional protective magic treasure that only a Tao master's disciples had? With the style of the chaotic region, once he was tempted, how could he not be greedy and want to take it for himself? However, even if he knew this, he didn't care. Although the Hungry Wolf City Lord could make the Hungry Wolf City Lord many times stronger than normal, there was still a limit to this kind of strength. For him, even if the Hungry Wolf City Lord had all kinds of advantages, his overall strength was still not enough. In such a situation, why should he be worried that the Hungry Wolf City Lord would pose any threat to him? Die! Suddenly, the Hungry Wolf City Lord roared. With this roar, a boundless starry sky suddenly appeared in the void. In this starry sky, Luo Fan could see Earth, the universe, the great desolate world, and many other perfect worlds. However, there wasn't a single world within it. This made this starry sky different from the starry sky outside. It was much sparser, and the degree of mystery was also much lower. After this starry sky appeared, it quickly turned from illusion to reality, breaking away from the originally illusory scene. Stars, in other words, perfect worlds, descended from the sky. As if transcending spacetime, they rapidly pounced towards Luo Fan. Before these stars even approached Luo Fan, the powerful aura they emitted had already affected the void around his body, affecting the laws around his body. Faintly, these laws began to break away from their original stability, gradually turning into a chaotic state where different laws were mixed together. This is a simulation of the laws in many perfect worlds? This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind when he saw this. His eyes could not help but light up slightly. Any perfect world contained endless mysteries, endless principles, and endless value. If one could simulate these laws one by one, analyze them, and divide them, it would be an opportunity for him to comprehend the countless other perfect laws of the world. It was even to the extent that because these laws were split from the laws of the heavens and the earth, one could indirectly comprehend the laws of the heavens and the earth through various comprehensions. This method, I want it. At this moment, Luo Fan said with a smile. As he said this, the unique spacetime dimension on his body began to tremble slightly. An illusory ball appeared out of thin air around his body. It was like an absolute barrier, isolating all the chaotic laws of the outside world. They could not even get close to him, let alone injure him. Chapter 1980. Facing the Hungry Wolf City Lord, Luo Fan just smiled inwardly. He didn't stop moving at all. He raised his hand and made a grabbing motion in front of him. In an instant, the boundless laws that simulated the perfect world were completely distorted by him and began to quickly transform into a state that was in line with the laws of the world view. The laws of the world were still an extremely firm and unshakable existence to him. Naturally, he would not be able to influence them so easily. However, the simulated laws of the perfect world in front of him were different. They were derived from the laws of the world. Although their foundation was the same as the laws of the world, their firmness had been shattered, causing them to be reduced to a level that Luo Fan could easily shake and influence. Under such circumstances, he could naturally deal with these simulated laws as easily as he dealt with the laws of the perfect world. The starry sky continued to sink, and the laws of the world continued to condense and stack, causing the chaos to become more and more intense. During this process, the space-time around Luo Fan's body began to fall into an inexplicable chaos. It felt as if countless worlds had been superimposed around him. This chaos was very serious. Amidst this chaos, Luo Fan's body was gradually shrouded by a kind of fog. This fog was very dense and chaotic. There was a faint aura of primal chaos in it. It seemed like it was going to completely devour and assimilate all existence at this moment. A big hand surged in the fog, constantly smoothing it and gradually turning it into a space-time that was getting stronger and more stable. At first glance, it looked the same as before, but in essence it had undergone earth-shaking changes. This was the space-time constructed by the laws of the worldview. For Luo Fan, it was a space-time that was equivalent to an absolute home field. After such a world appeared, naturally, he began to reject all the laws in Hungry Wolf City. For the Hungry Wolf City Lord, this was like cutting off a piece of flesh from his body. After all, the Hungry Wolf City Lord had used Hungry Wolf City as the foundation to become a false saint. To him, Hungry Wolf City was equivalent to a part of his body. Now, a part of Hungry Wolf City Lord had been cut off and turned into another law that was controlled by another creature. This was equivalent to a part of his body being separated from his control and being controlled by someone else. It went without saying how painful and sorrowful that feeling was. Good move. It is indeed worthy of being a dimensional protective treasure. At this moment, the Hungry Wolf City Lord still didn't regard all these methods as Luo Fan's strength. On the contrary, he thought that all these were the power of the so-called dimensional protective treasure. It was precisely because of this understanding that when he faced this ability that he couldn't resist, although he was afraid, he still felt that he had a chance of winning. He felt that he had the possibility of taking this dimensional protective treasure for himself. Driven by this greedy thought, just now, he had displayed an indomitable will. He had used all his strength to activate the simulation of the starry sky to condense the simulated laws and principles to crush Luo Fan. When Luo Fan saw this scene, he knew in his heart that this Hungry Wolf City Lord was not only capable, but also had other means. The simulated starry sky in front of him seemed to be just a cover to attract his attention. Under such circumstances, although he seemed to have the upper hand at this time, he didn't relax at all. He still paid attention to his surroundings with extreme vigilance, and was extremely vigilant to resist the alternative attack of the Hungry Wolf City Lord that might appear next. At this moment, the simulated starry sky began to slowly circulate. The corresponding perfect worlds began to move gradually. As they moved, various kinds of indescribable power began to gradually fuse, gradually complementing each other, faintly forming an incomparably huge array. It began to emit a power that surpassed all perfect laws of heaven and earth. It continued to press down, gradually pressing down on the fog around Luo Fan's body, causing the fog to gradually tremble and faintly collapse. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan frowned. He could sense an inexplicable familiarity from the power of this huge array. Faintly, it already had the characteristics of the laws of heaven and earth. The laws of heaven and earth were absolutely firm and stable. With Luo Fan's current ability, it was already his limit to borrow such laws. It was almost impossible to shake them or change them. The power emitted by the array in front of him actually had the characteristics of the laws of heaven and earth. This also caused the stability of this power to almost exceed the range that he could bear. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan wasn't moved at all. With a thought, he suddenly controlled the countless superimposed laws of the world of laws around him and began to move upwards, blasting the power of the array that was pressing down. In this collision, earth-shattering shock waves erupted. The Hungry Wolf City Lord began to shake violently under this shock. At this moment, countless amounts of blood spurted out from all over the Hungry Wolf City Lord's body. As for the hundreds of thousands of cultivators around him, they collapsed one by one. Amidst the loud rumbling sounds, 1/3 of them turned into a powerful shock wave that spread in all directions. This tragic change caused the Hungry Wolf City Lord's expression to change uncontrollably. There was a hint of regret and resentment in his eyes. However, after this lament and resentment, his expression became resolute once again. However, it was because of this. He urged his methods even more forcefully, causing the countless stars in the starry sky to rotate even faster. More stars and more perfect heavens and earth were added to the formation. As the array rotated, it began to release more and more powerful power and began to gather. It continued to evolve, gradually producing an even more terrifying power that pressed down on Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan's expression had already become extremely solemn. He didn't expect that the Hungry Wolf City Lord's greatest attack would actually be the starry sky. Moreover, at this moment, he didn't care about the damage that the Hungry Wolf City Lord was doing. His determination was so strong that even he was a little shocked. It seems that the dimensional protective artifact he mentioned is more precious than I thought. With this thought in mind, his eyes began to shine brightly. The laws and laws of the world of laws around him began to condense continuously, faintly turning into the shape of a sphere. It resisted the terrifying power that was constantly crushing down from above with great difficulty. The strength and toughness of this power was beyond imagination. It was beyond imagination. Under such circumstances, this crushing force was naturally indescribably strong. Faced with such a crushing power, even though Luo Fan had condensed the laws of the world of laws into the form of the world of laws, he still couldn't bear it for a while. Under the crushing power, it constantly shook and cracked. Countless tiny fragments were constantly splashing in all directions, gradually causing the sphere to become more and more broken. It was faintly on the verge of completely collapsing. At this moment, Luo Fan felt an indescribable pain continuously gushing out from the depths of his heart, invading his entire body and sweeping away all his senses. At this moment, he didn't even have the strength to think about any other problems. He could only mechanically and futilely stabilize the laws around his body, stabilizing his world of laws. He realized that he had really underestimated the Hungry Wolf City Lord this time. The fact that the Hungry Wolf City Lord was able to occupy a territory in the chaotic region and stabilize it meant that he definitely had something extraordinary about him. Just the power of a false saint must be hiding some unimaginable means for him to be able to do this, but Luo Fan couldn't see this at all. He just came to the Hungry Wolf City Lord recklessly, and now, he was at a disadvantage. However, it was already meaningless to think about this at this moment. At this moment, all his mind and attention were completely focused on resisting the opponent's crushing power. After all, this scene derived from the laws of laws was his world of laws. The weak part of it was also the weak part of his world of laws. And the strong part was also the strong part of his world of laws. Now, the ball was constantly cracking and countless fragments were flying in all directions. Although this looked extremely tragic, it was also a rare experience. The faster the part that collapsed and cracked, the weakest part of his world of laws, and so on. In the end, the part that collapsed and cracked was the most stable and powerful part of his world of laws. In other words, he only needed to look at the way the ball collapsed to know where he was lacking and which direction he should improve in. As this mentality gradually emerged, Luo Fan's expression had unknowingly become calm again. He came to this world to find an opportunity to improve, to enhance his strength, and to strengthen his essence to deal with the fourth great tribulation. Now that he had just arrived here, he had already found an opportunity. It seemed that he had found a way. Wasn't this also a kind of opportunity for him? With such a change in mentality, his movements became more and more natural. Under his control, the spherical laws of laws began to be repaired bit by bit. Although 99% of them quickly collapsed every time they were repaired, there was still a little bit that remained for a long time. At this moment, the body of the Hungry Wolf City Lord began to tremble continuously. The entire vast Hungry Wolf City began to gradually break away from the illusory plane and gradually become real. The incomparably huge and majestic wild wolf that was originally in the real plane began to gradually become illusory, gradually returning to the illusory plane. The living beings in Hungry Wolf City began to crumble one by one. The first to collapse were the itinerant immortal cultivators. These cultivators were like poor people in Hungry Wolf City, and their strength was so weak. Compared to the terrifying changes that affected the entire illusory plane and the real plane, their endurance was naturally the weakest. It was only natural that they would be the first to collapse. For a time, the entire Hungry Wolf City was filled with the sound of explosions. Boom, 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 boom. The explosions caused the surrounding buildings to collapse. In the blink of an eye, Hungry Wolf City had been completely destroyed. The originally bustling scene turned into a wasteland after a battle. This kind of change caused countless people to panic. It was unknown how many cultivators flew into the sky to look at the changes below in shock. He wanted to find the source of the change. Soon, they found the source of the problem. For a moment, countless creatures focused their gazes on Hungry Wolf City Lord and Luo Fan. From the looks of it, only these two powerhouses were responsible for all these tragic changes at this time. One of the cultivators kept begging. They cried and begged the two of them to give them a way out, to restrain themselves a little, or to leave Hungry Wolf City to fight in other places. But it was obvious that this voice couldn't leave any traces in their hearts. They were still immersed in their own attacks and the other party's attacks. Gradually, some of the creatures noticed this. They immediately made up their minds and quickly headed out of Hungry Wolf City. However, the originally smooth passages had now become incomparably difficult. Thousands of cultivators tried to break through the passage, but only a handful of cultivators were able to break through and leave Hungry Wolf City. Furthermore, this cultivator, who was less than a palm in size, was not even the strongest cultivator. It was almost random. Sometimes, it was only primordial pure yang cultivators who passed through the passageway. Instead, it was quasi-sages or even pseudo-sages who could not pass through the passageway at all. They directly collapsed in the chaos of the passageway and completely turned into powder. This kind of random change that depended entirely on luck made the strong resentful, while the weak began to rejoice. For a time, even more cultivators tried to break through the passage. When the tree falls, the monkeys scatter. If it was a normal situation, the Hungry Wolf City Lord would definitely hate it and want to kill all of them. But at this time, he didn't have the energy to care about them. At this time, in order to maintain the formation in the starry sky, not only did he put all of his strength into it, he even used a treasure that he used to protect his life. How could he have the energy to care about the cultivators that he considered to be cannon fodder? At this time, although the sphere around Luo Fan's body was recovering bit by bit under his continuous efforts, the recovery speed still couldn't compare to the crushing speed of the formation's powerful force. In the end, the sphere was still constantly collapsing and shattering. There were still bits and pieces of it constantly drifting out from it. From the looks of it, it seemed like he was walking towards defeat and death. In fact, it was also because of this that the Hungry Wolf City Lord was confident that he could suppress Luo Fan. It was also why he was so determined to defeat him at this time. If Luo Fan didn't show such signs of defeat, no matter how greedy the Hungry Wolf City Lord was, how could he disregard the truth and forcibly use everything he had when he knew that it would be difficult for him to win? Die. Very soon, that dimensional protective magic treasure will be mine. As long as I get that dimensional protective magic treasure, I will be able to embark on that path. The Hungry Wolf City Lord muttered, the greed and madness in his eyes becoming increasingly fervent. What he said was not only to state the fundamental reason why he did what he did, but also to convince himself at the same time. He convinced himself that this was the right thing to do. He convinced himself that it was worth it to abandon the Hungry Wolf City and his life-saving treasure. From the looks of it, his method was quite successful. At this time, he had indeed strengthened his confidence, gathered his faith, and activated his means even more crazily, making Luo Fan feel even more pressure, causing the laws around him to shatter at an even faster rate. However, this wasn't a constant trend. As time passed, the speed of the shattering began to gradually slow down. The countless tiny laws that were produced at the edge of the shattering cracks also began to become more and more stable, and they began to remain in the crushing power for a longer time. This situation clearly showed that Luo Fan's completion of the worldview was becoming more and more effective. However, at this time, 3 years had already passed. In these 3 years, the entire Hungry Wolf City had completely broken away from the illusory plane and truly stood on the real plane, appearing on the great earth. After 3 years, in the entire Hungry Wolf City, apart from the city lord of Hungry Wolf City and the troops under his control, which numbered in the tens of thousands, Luo Fan was the only one left in Hungry Wolf City. The other cultivators and creatures had either died or fled, but they had all disappeared without a trace. Chapter 1981. At this moment, a faint expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. The law power in his body began to boil and frantically flowed out of his body. In an instant, it had already integrated with the laws of the world of laws that had become extremely broken. Originally, the battle between Luo Fan and Hungry Wolf City Lord was already at a stalemate. Although Luo Fan's own methods were constantly collapsing under Hungry Wolf City Lord's attacks, they still came and went after all. It was also because of this that the Hungry Wolf City Lord was determined to continue to attack him, and that was why he continued to use his attacks. Under such circumstances, he added the law power. Such a fresh force instantly overturned the original situation, causing the power formed by the huge formation in the starry sky to be suddenly blocked. The impact that erupted at this moment was so strong that it was beyond the imagination of all living beings. In an instant, Hungry Wolf City that was originally able to survive began to rapidly collapse. All the buildings that existed in it seemed to be crushed by an unimaginable force at this moment and collapsed bit by bit. How is this possible? At this moment, Hungry Wolf City Lord's eyes revealed a look of disbelief as he let out a loud roar. Previously, when he was facing Luo Fan, he was obviously able to gain the upper hand. Although the opponent still had a lot of resistance, he was still able to win little by little. But now, he didn't know what sort of technique his opponent had used, but all of his attacks had actually turned into bubbles and were unable to harm him at all. This sort of situation, to Hungry Wolf City Governor, who had already pressed everything he had, was simply cutting off all of his hopes. How could he not feel disbelief? How could he not feel a sense of loss of control at this moment? Under the counterattack, Hungry Wolf City Lord's body began to collapse bit by bit. The many cultivators attached to his body to help him maintain his methods and his powerful attack. At this moment, it was as if their roots had been extracted. They began to melt one by one and their power scattered in all directions. It looked like huge fireworks were constantly appearing on Hungry Wolf City Lord's body. Incomparably mournful screams rang out. At this moment, it came from Hungry Wolf City Lord's body. Amidst the mournful screams, the Hungry Wolf City Lord's body began to gradually melt. His towering body seemed to have turned into plasticine and began to gradually lose its shape. Gradually, it turned back into a ball and lost its human form. At the same time, the simulated starry sky above began to shake. The endless sky and earth in the starry sky started to lose its position, and the mysterious array gradually became chaotic. As for the starry sky, it gradually shrank and shrank. The countless stars that originally existed in it, which were the countless perfect worlds, started to lose their corporeal nature. Unknowingly, it had already turned into a color that was depicted on a certain canvas. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan's eyes lit up. So, this is a starry sky carved by a powerhouse. In an instant, various thoughts flashed through his mind. He had a rough understanding of how the method to simulate the starry sky had come about. After understanding this, he quickly developed an indescribable sense of worry. To be able to force him to this point with just a painting and undergo such intense tempering of his worldview, just how powerful was the existence that drew this painting? And the Hungry Wolf City Lord was able to obtain such a painting. In that case, just how deep was his background? These thoughts kept flashing through his mind. Then, he secretly gritted his teeth. Without hesitation, he raised his hand and grabbed at the void above him. A wave of law power quickly flew out of his body at this moment and directly turned into a huge palm of law power. It penetrated the barrier of the void and brazenly arrived around the painting, directly grabbing at it. At this moment, the hungry wolf city master finally reacted. He turned pale with fright and shouted, "You dare? This is a treasure bestowed by the Tao Master. If you dare to snatch it, you will be provoking the Tao Master. Do you want to die?" Hearing this, Luo Fan frowned and turned his head to look at the shocked expression on the hungry wolf city lord's face. He knew in his heart that these words were probably not true. Perhaps it was from the Tao Master, but it was very likely that it was not bestowed to him by the Tao Master. Instead, he had snatched it by some means. Seeing this, he naturally no longer hesitated and continued to move. The law power condensed in his palm had already completely grasped the painting depicting the starry sky in his hand. At this moment, a strong struggle came from the painting. Under this struggle, Luo Fan felt that his palm began to become uneven. A powerful force was constantly attacking and stirring it, causing him to have no choice but to add even stronger law power into it to keep the painting in his hand. At this moment, he finally understood what was going on with this painting. This painting was indeed from an extremely powerful expert, and it was even possible that he was really a disciple of the True Saints sect and the Tao Master. However, the True Saints sect and the Tao Master's disciples were either dead or imprisoned. They could no longer sense this painting, let alone control it. No wonder he was so frightened. No wonder he could only open up Hungry Wolf City after obtaining this painting, and not go to other wonderful places to establish a sect. Such thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and a smile of understanding appeared on his face. With this smile, the palm condensed by his law power had already wrapped around the painting and appeared in front of him. Luo Fan casually grabbed the painting. There was an inexplicable sense of death and inactivity in it, which made him even more certain of his previous thoughts. At this moment, the Hungry Wolf City Lord looked as if he had lost his parents. His entire body was like plasticine that was constantly churning in the air, unable to condense into an innate Taoism body at all. The undulating bumps and bumps on the surface, as well as the force that kept striking and stirring in all directions, further confirmed how chaotic his emotions were at this moment. "I originally wanted to ask you what method you used to simulate that starry sky, but it seems that there's no need for that now," Luo Fan said faintly. As he said this, he casually slapped the plasticine. A mysterious law power had already brazenly crossed time and space, and directly arrived in front of the plasticine. It instantly seeped into it and began to wildly destroy it. At this moment, countless mournful roars came from the plasticine, and those voices contained pain and sorrow, as well as deep fear. "Spare me, spare me!" In the end, the countless cries turned into shrill begging for mercy. At this moment, the lump of plasticine had already turned into a figure that was less than 10 feet tall, quietly floating in the air. Although this figure had shrunk by 10,000 times, it really looked like the Hungry Wolf City Lord. However, at this moment, he no longer had the greed and confidence from before. Instead, there was only fear and pleading. He knelt before Luo Fan in the air, and continuously kowtowed. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh. The style of this world was indeed completely different from the worlds he had experienced in the past. If it was in other worlds, an existence at the false saint level was considered a powerhouse no matter what, so they would definitely have great pride in their hearts. Even if they failed, they would at most perish together with others, but they would never lower themselves to beg for mercy. This thought flashed through his mind, and in an instant, he had already obtained the answer. He understood why there was such a change. In this other perfect world, even if a false saint wasn't the strongest, he was still considered a powerhouse. No matter what, his status was considered to be at the top. However, in this world, the situation wasn't like this. In this world, an existence like a false saint was probably only in the middle. He couldn't even be considered a powerhouse, since there were even powerhouses this kind of false saint. Naturally, there wouldn't be too many powerhouses who would directly kowtow and beg for mercy after failure. This wasn't something incomprehensible. After understanding this, he just smiled faintly and grabbed out with his hand, sealing the entire body of the Hungry Wolf City Lord in front of him. All of his power and even his consciousness were completely sealed, causing the Hungry Wolf City Lord to turn into a statue. He quietly floated in the air, maintaining the posture of kowtowing and begging for mercy. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart moved slightly, and he scanned the surroundings with his perception. In an instant, he sensed that in an extremely distant place, there were figures paying attention to this place from afar. Everything that happened here just now had completely happened under their noses. After such a long battle, Hungry Wolf City was also the area with the best cultivation environment in this area, so the changes here would naturally attract the attention of other powerhouses. Naturally, there would be powerful beings who would sense and cast their gazes over from all directions. However, these powerhouses even cared about the power of the Hungry Wolf City Lord. No matter how powerful he was, there was still a limit. Facing Luo Fan, who could easily deal with the Hungry Wolf City Lord in Hungry Wolf City, they didn't dare to provoke him. When they sensed Luo Fan's perception sweeping over them, they all began to retreat in panic like stray dogs. They turned into streaks of light and shot into the distance, not daring to stop at all. When Luo Fan saw this, he only smiled faintly. Waves of law power instantly followed his perception and crossed the air, instantly descending on those living beings. In an instant, hundreds of cultivators were completely annihilated, leaving behind only miserable screams and traces of energy explosions in the air. The reason why he wanted to kill these cultivators was very simple. It was because of the painting that Luo Fan had obtained. After all, this painting came from the Tao Sovereign's sect. Its preciousness could be seen from the countless laws and laws around his body that had yet to fully recover. It went without saying how soul-stirring such an existence was. Although it was unlikely that those cultivators knew all of this, it was better to be safe than sorry. If there was a clear-headed cultivator among those cultivators with strong eyesight, then wouldn't he have leaked his secret? At that time, countless cultivators would swarm over. Although he wasn't afraid, it would still be quite troublesome. It was precisely because of this that he had casually wiped out those spectating cultivators. Anyway, to him, these cultivators were still too weak after all, and the process of wiping them out didn't even need to use much energy. Moreover, this was in line with the rules of the chaotic region. After completely wiping out the many witnesses, Luo Fan's heart moved. With a light step, he grabbed the Hungry Wolf City Lord and disappeared from this area, leaving only the ruins of the Hungry Wolf City on the ground, showing the earth-shattering battle that had once taken place here to all living beings in the world. When Luo Fan reappeared, he had already arrived in an area that was tens of thousands of miles away from the Hungry Wolf City. Even in the chaotic region, this region was considered to be quite chaotic. However, there were only settlements here, and there weren't even any cities. In this area, there weren't many powerhouses that had truly surpassed the false saint stage, but there were countless cultivators below that. When Luo Fan arrived here, he sensed the aura. It instantly made him understand that this was the best place for him to stay at this moment. He casually picked an uninhabited mountain, and with a thought, his power surged. He easily flattened the mountain and built a cave abode in it. This kind of method was an extremely powerful method for the living beings in this area. In an instant, it made those living beings know that Luo Fan wasn't someone to be trifled with. The cultivators who had originally wanted to pounce on Luo Fan to take him down instantly shrank back. They were afraid that Luo Fan would know what they were thinking, but they didn't dare to do anything else. Luo Fan didn't care about the various changes in the mentality of these weak cultivators. He stepped into the cave abode. With a casual throw, he threw the hungry wolf city lord to the ground, causing the seal on him to disappear in an instant, allowing him to regain consciousness. When he recovered, the hungry wolf city lord's face was filled with shock. It took him a while to realize that he was already in an area far away from the hungry wolf city. He had also returned to being an ordinary false saint. For a moment, the panic in his heart increased, and he knelt even more sincerely. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and said, "Why do you want my so-called dimensional protective treasure so much?" This seemed to be what Luo Fan was most curious about. After all, the beginning of the battle with the hungry wolf city lord was when he discovered that he actually had the so-called dimensional protective treasure. This way, it was obvious that this dimensional protective treasure definitely had a stronger meaning and contained a deeper secret. If that wasn't the case, the hungry wolf city lord wouldn't have been so crazy. When the hungry wolf city lord heard this, he hurriedly kowtowed and said, "I was blinded by lard. Please forgive me, exalted immortal." Hearing this, Luo Fan frowned and said, "This isn't what I want to hear. If you continue talking nonsense, I'll take your life. Don't think that I can't search your soul." Hearing this, the hungry wolf city lord's body trembled and he hurriedly said, "Yes, yes, yes. The reason why I have such an unrealistic ambition is because with that dimensional protective treasure, I can try to challenge the Tao Master Path established by many Tao Masters." Tao Master Path. When Luo Fan heard this, his heart couldn't help but skip a beat. At this moment, he suddenly remembered that there seemed to be a saint path in the Tianyuan Great World. Could it be that the Tao Master Path was similar to the saint path? Didn't this mean that the path to becoming a saint was a necessary path for every great world? What is this Tao Master Path? Suppressing the shock in his heart, he asked. The Tao Master Path is specially opened by many Tao Masters to guide the younger generation. It's a path. It is said that if you pass this Tao Master Path, you can become a Tao Master. Since ancient times, among the 3,000 Tao Masters, there seemed to be a few who became Tao Masters by passing through the Tao Master Path. At this moment, hungry wolf city lord had an indescribable longing on his face. It was obvious that he was extremely eager to become a Tao Master. Sure enough, it's similar to the Saint Path. At this time, such a thought flashed in Luo Fan's mind. For a moment, he had more ideas and more speculations about the standard configuration of the many world. He felt as if a whole new world had opened up in front of him. Why do you need dimensional protective treasures to break into the Tao Master Path? Luo Fan asked again. Hearing this, the hungry wolf city lord said, "This is the experience left behind by the seniors who have passed the Tao Master Path. It's said that any cultivator, unless they've mastered the mysteries of the dimension, would need a dimensional protective magic treasure to have the qualifications to attempt to pass the Tao Master's path. Otherwise, no matter how strong they are, how terrifying their power is, and how noble their status is, it's impossible for them to pass the Tao Master's path. It's even impossible for them to escape from it." Chapter 1982. Luo Fan inquired about the Tao Master's road in detail. The hungry wolf city lord obviously had no moral integrity at all. He answered all of Luo Fan's questions without reserve. No matter what Luo Fan asked, he honestly told him everything he knew. Through this kind of inquiry, he soon knew all kinds of things about the Tao Master's road, including how to enter the Tao Master's road, which aspects of the Tao Master's road had always been dangerous, and so on. In a way, the hungry wolf city lord, who had obtained the starry sky painted by the Tao Master, knew far more than an existence at his level could know. Luo Fan had really chosen the right person to choose him this time. After all these things, the hungry wolf city lord looked at Luo Fan with a rather perturbed expression. Now, he had almost no bargaining chip. Whether he could survive, and what price he would pay to survive, all depended on Luo Fan's will. For the Hungry Wolf City Lord, who had completely abandoned his moral integrity in order to save his life, it was self-evident how much psychological pressure this situation brought to him. However, at this time, he could only wait for the judgment of fate. It was not that he did not want to hide some key points, waiting for Luo Fan to give him a promise before telling him. Instead, it was because for existences at their level, soul-searching and memory reading were abilities that did not require much of a threshold. If his answer did not satisfy the other party, all his secrets would be known by the other party after a soul search. At that time, what choice would the other party, who had been concealed, even trembled at the thought of it? Luo Fan faintly said, "This painting, where did you get it from?" As he spoke, he unfolded the painting drawn by the Tao Master's disciples. Seeing this painting, the Hungry Wolf City Lord's eyes revealed a look of pain, obviously still somewhat reluctant to give up such a painting. However, the situation was stronger than the person. In the end, he still recognized the situation and lowered his head at this time. He carefully said, "I got this at the entrance of a Tao Master's road." "Oh, in other words, the celestial cave peak you once visited?" Luo Fan suddenly understood. According to Hungry Wolf City Lord, there were many entrances to the Tao Master's path. Some of the entrances were public entrances that were almost completely exposed. Any living being could find them and enter the Tao Master's path through those entrances. However, some of the entrances were secret entrances. It did not reject any living beings from entering. However, finding the entrance was an extremely difficult task. The Heaven Cave Peak was one of the secret entrances to the Tao Master's path. Back then, Hungry Wolf City Lord had discovered this entrance through a fortuitous encounter. After that, he had learned many secrets of the Tao Master's path through this entrance. This was also why he had such a deep understanding of the Tao Master's path when he was only at the false saint stage. It seems that the road to becoming a Tao Master is very dangerous. He's even stronger than I imagined. Luo Fan thought to himself, to be able to draw such a painting, even if he was a disciple of the Tao Master, he must be a powerful existence beyond imagination. But it was such an existence that had lost his life the moment he stepped onto the Tao Master's path. Even this treasure had been thrown out and left the Tao Master's path to be obtained by a weakling like Hungry Wolf City Lord. The various entrances to the Tao Master's path didn't seem to be any different from the outside, but it was said that the locations of the entrances were not the same. Some entrances were only at the beginning of the Tao Master's path. Some entrances were said to have gone deep into the Tao Master's path. Of course, this was only a rumor. As for whether it was true or not, there had always been only rumors. And there was no truly accurate and credible evidence. After asking all these questions, Luo Fan no longer had any more questions to ask Hungry Wolf City Lord. Immediately, he smiled faintly and said, "Tell me, should I kill you directly or erase your memories?" Hearing this, Hungry Wolf City Lord hurriedly said, "Erase my memories, erase my memories." Erasing his memories was an extremely tragic misfortune for an existence at his level. It could even make him no longer his original self. However, he was still alive. Compared to being completely killed, it was naturally better. Perhaps, for other creatures who would rather die than submit, erasing their memories would make them rather lose their lives, die and scatter their souls. However, it was obvious that this did not include Hungry Wolf City Lord. Seeing this, Luo Fan naturally followed suit. In any case, to him, the life of Hungry Wolf City Lord was not necessary at all. As long as the other party did not reveal the secret that he had obtained the painting from the Tao Master's path, it was fine. Thus, at this moment, he raised his hand and pointed at Hungry Wolf City Lord's forehead. Then, with a slight pull, strands of blue light slowly separated from his forehead and began to float around in the surrounding space-time. At this moment, there were countless flickering lights in the surroundings, corresponding to the lost memories of Hungry Wolf City Lord. At the same time, Hungry Wolf City Lord's eyes revealed some indescribable pain and confusion, and his body began to tremble. The power in his body instinctively circulated, wanting to resist Luo Fan's extraction of his memories. However, it was a pity that this instinctive resistance was nothing to Luo Fan. The extraction of memories was not affected in the slightest, and they continued to break out from his heart in an endless stream. During this process, Luo Fan didn't just stand there and do nothing. In fact, while he was continuously extracting the memories, he was also continuously reading those memories to confirm whether or not Hungry Wolf City Lord was lying or hiding something. The reason why he had used that kind of questioning method to understand this kind of species from Hungry Wolf City Lord was because of this. He would definitely read the other party's memories, so he did not need to worry about the other party lying or hiding anything. Through reading the memories, he finally discovered that Hungry Wolf City Lord was really too honest. Because the contents of the other party's story were really not hidden at all. All of the content could be found in the depths of his memories. I originally planned to kill him along the way, but now it's not easy for me to do so. Luo Fan looked at the many memories. In the end, he still sighed in his heart. In the end, he completely erased almost all of his memories. With a casual toss of his hand, Hungry Wolf City Lord turned into a ray of light and charged out, flying in a certain direction. In the blink of an eye, he had already disappeared from this area. As a false saint, although he could not be considered a true powerhouse in this world, he could not be considered a weakling. Even if he lost his memories, he still wanted to survive in this world. It was not difficult. After throwing Hungry Wolf City Lord away, Luo Fan's expression became solemn as he slowly unfolded the painting that simulated the starry sky. This painting contained endless mysteries, and it could even separate the laws of the world and create the countless perfect laws of the world. To him, it was the best cultivation item. With a slight thought, his perception slowly seeped into the painting. Inside this painting, there were endless Tao talismans and endless restrictions. If it was fully unfolded, it would probably be enough to split into billions of magic treasures. Or rather, it was a painting. In fact, it was a very mysterious and special magic treasure. His perception shuttled between the endless Tao talismans and endless restrictions, constantly going deeper into its core. The reason he was able to seize this painting so easily from Hungry Wolf City's city master earlier was because Hungry Wolf City's city master hadn't completely refined this painting. In the tens of millions of years since he obtained this painting, he had only used his own strength to forcefully grind through its surface and leave his initial mark on it. Luo Fan wanted to avoid such bad luck, lest this treasure be easily taken away by other powerhouses when he faced them. He needed to completely refine this treasure. Only in this way could he make it impossible for others to deprive him of this treasure. He needed to find the core of this treasure. It was not a simple matter. If it was simple, Hungry Wolf City Lord would not have only completed the initial refinement after tens of millions of years. In this painting, every single star corresponded to countless talismans, and they corresponded to a huge amount of restrictions. The number of stars in this painting amounted to 12,960,000. Even if Luo Fan had an extremely strong sensing ability, and the intensity of his perception was so strong that it was unimaginable, it was not easy to find every Tao talisman and every restriction at once. Furthermore, there were countless combinations within the Tao talisman. The restrictions also had countless connections. When all of these were combined together, the complexity of the Tao talisman was several tens of thousands of times greater than before. As Luo Fan began to sense the Tao talismans and restrictions in the painting, the light and shadow on the painting began to rotate, and there was a faint brilliance that gradually shone out. At this moment, the laws within the cave abode changed slightly. Countless changes that didn't exist before appeared out of thin air in the cave abode. The cave dwelling that originally looked like a starry sky, Opening up a starry sky as one's cave dwelling for cultivation was already Luo Fan's habit, became more mysterious and profound. The stars seemed to gradually turn into a perfect world, and the position of the stars seemed to gradually shift to another position. Luo Fan did not pay any attention to the changes in the outside world. At this moment, he only focused his mind on the inside of the painting, on the endless Tao talismans, and the endless restrictions. After spending 3 years, he finally understood every single talisman and every single restriction. At this moment, endless information and principles erupted from the endless Tao talismans and restrictions and poured into his heart. This amount of information far exceeded what ordinary living beings could endure. He could imagine that if the Hungry Wolf City Master had also received such a huge amount of information, then he would absolutely not be able to wait for Luo Fan to fight him. His body and mind would have already collapsed, and all traces of his existence would have been completely erased. Such a terrifying amount of information was also a huge burden for Luo Fan. As this information poured in, he only felt as if there were countless things that were countless times larger than him constantly pouring into his body, constantly filling up his body. That feeling of fullness. The feeling of fullness made him feel as if his body was going to explode in the next moment. This endless information did not contain the numerous laws of perfect heaven and earth. Instead, it contained a kind of decomposition and transformation law. It involved nothing else but the decomposition and transformation of the laws of the great world into the laws of the perfect world. Of course, although this decomposition and transformation law was already extremely complicated, it would not have been so much information that it made Luo Fan feel so uncomfortable. In fact, there was even more than that, and that was the specific parameters of the various perfect worlds. These specific parameters were quite complicated and numerous. It was rather complicated, and the quantity was also considerable. If it was substituted into the decomposition and transformation laws, it would naturally be able to decompose and transform the laws of a perfect world. I can't believe they actually used this method to obtain these laws. After coming back to his senses, Luo Fan had an inexplicable look of shock on his face. This method was many times stronger than what he had originally thought. In his original imagination, he had only included the laws of the perfect world, but it was just an accumulation of experience and the result of collecting a large number of laws of the perfect world. Although it was mysterious, it was still something he could imagine. But, in reality, the evolution of the laws had already risen to the theoretical level. What parameters of the perfect world would trigger changes in the final laws, and what would it eventually look like? All of this had far exceeded the scope of his understanding. If this is the case, if I input the various parameters of the world of laws into it, wouldn't I be able to obtain all the laws of the world of laws at the level of the perfect world? Suddenly, such a thought flashed in Luo Fan's mind. This thought made him inexplicably excited. One had to know that his current worldview was the foundation of his cultivation. The root of cultivation was the progress of the world of laws. This was his progress and the omission of the world of laws. This was the omission of his cultivation. With the world of laws that he had now mastered, it was impossible to form a truly perfect world, so naturally, it was impossible to form the laws of the perfect world. But if there was a method that could allow him to obtain all the laws of the world of laws in advance, he would naturally be able to recognize some of the omissions of the world of laws through reverse deduction. Then it would be endless for him to perfect the world of laws. Perhaps, apart from the path of the Tao Master, this is the opportunity that brought me to this world. Luo Fan sighed leisurely with an inexplicable expression on his face. When he opened his eyes, he found that his cave residence in front of him had been completely assimilated by the painting, becoming exactly the same as the painting. As for the painting, it seemed to have turned into the center of this starry sky, controlling the operation of the entire starry sky. As the starry sky operated, It faintly exuded a kind of unimaginable potential, causing the surrounding laws to no longer look like the big world. It seemed to be all-encompassing, but also seemed to be nothing at all. This was similar to the primal chaos state. Perhaps this is the true use of this painting. Previously, Hungry Wolf City Lord directly used that painting. Comparatively speaking, it's really crude. Looking at this, Luo Fan came to a realization in his heart. The laws of the starry sky in front of him were thousands of times more powerful than the attacks that Hungry Wolf City Lord had displayed before Luo Fan. If it wasn't for the fact that Luo Fan was holding the painting in his hand and wasn't affected by all the changes in the outside world, he might have already been torn to pieces by the changes in the laws of the world. How could this kind of strength be comparable to the power that Hungry Wolf City Lord had displayed back then? With a slight thought, the painting in his hand trembled slightly, and a star in the starry sky outside suddenly enlarged and began to rush towards him. In the blink of an eye, it had already enveloped him, causing him to be completely enveloped by a completely unfamiliar law. This law was the law of a perfect world. However, this perfect world was not the primordial world, nor was it the Earth's universe, nor was it a fragment of the big world. Instead, it was a perfect world that he had never come into contact with before. Under the extremely perfect law, the surrounding light and shadows faintly changed, revealing a boundless world. However, everything was hazy, faintly discernible. Moreover, everything seemed inexplicably mechanical, as if there was no life or energy at all. This innate Taoism body also looks like Panga's figure? After carefully examining it, Luo Fan was slightly stunned, and a hint of surprise appeared in his eyes. However, he discovered that in the mechanical scene there was the appearance of the intelligent creature, but it was surprisingly similar to his current appearance. Chapter 1983. With a thought, the star began to shrink again, turning into its original tiny form. It rose into the starry sky again and continued to emit light in the starry sky, decorating the deep night sky. Then, under his control, another star began to enlarge and gradually sink, finally enveloping him. The rules and laws around his body also began to change, gradually changing into a completely unfamiliar set of rules and laws of a perfect world. The change in the rules and laws naturally brought about changes in the light and shadow, gradually causing the light and shadow around his body to gradually reveal a completely unfamiliar scene. The appearance of this perfect world was completely gaseous. All the creatures that existed there were also all kinds of gaseous creatures. The combination of the creatures contained a miracle that Luo Fan had never imagined. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan frowned and began to carefully distinguish the images of the many living creatures revealed in the light and shadow around him. Finally, after distinguishing them clearly, his expression became somewhat serious. This was because he discovered that the born Taoism body of this world did not look like Pangu. In other words, it did not look exactly the same as his current figure. This situation represented a fact, and that was that the rules of decomposition and transformation did not limit the born Taoism body of this world to a human form. This also meant that the perfect world's born Taoism body looked exactly the same as Pangu, and it represented the born Taoism body of that perfect world. This was indeed what it looked like. What exactly is the reason for this? Could it be that those perfect worlds were all created by the true saints of this great world, who left this great world and went to the chaos to create it? Or, this great world is the same as the other perfect worlds and came from the same source? It's just that this great world was lucky enough to become a great world. Such doubts surfaced in his mind at this moment. If it was the first reason, it would be fine. At least it meant that he was now in contact with the final source. However, if it was the second reason, then it would be completely different. Could it be that there is a higher-level world above this great world? Suddenly, such a thought emerged in his mind. However, very soon, he shook his head. It was no different from the various ridiculous guesses he had in the past. To him, it was still too far away. At his current level, he was not even a true divine. Even the perfect heaven and earth was enough for him to explore. The great heaven and earth was already the limit of what he could come into contact with. As for whether there were any levels of heaven and earth above the great heaven and earth, that was clearly not within the scope of his exploration. Sighing in his heart, he suppressed these thoughts at the bottom of his heart. With a single thought, he began shrinking the laws and laws in this perfect world, causing the planet to shrink once more. It turned into an ordinary planet and returned to the galaxy. Afterwards, he turned his gaze towards the world that he was most familiar with. The primordial world, as he thought of this, the star that represented the untainted world began to descend from the sky and gradually overlapped with where he was. During this process, the star continued to expand and grow. In the end, it completely transformed the surrounding rules and laws into something that was almost the same as the untainted world's rules and laws. As he comprehended the surrounding rules and laws that were completely the same as the untainted world, and looked at the various scenes that could only be found in the untainted world, Luo Fan had an inexplicable sigh on his face. Such a vast world, but it turns out that it is just a combination of some parameters and a kind of decomposition and transformation law. He sighed leisurely. If it was before, he would naturally be extremely interested in comprehending the rules and laws of the countless perfect worlds through this galaxy, so that his view of the world could receive the greatest stimulation and thus obtain the greatest growth. However, after understanding the essence of all this, he no longer had such thoughts. If he was still comprehending the rules and laws of the countless perfect worlds, wouldn't it mean that he clearly knew the source of everything, but he was only entangled at the end? What was the difference between this and continuously plucking the branches and leaves from the top of a tree? As he sighed in his heart, the decomposition and transformation law began to appear in his mind. The laws of decomposition and transformation were extremely complex and abstruse. It was almost impossible for the current Luo Fan to understand it. Not only did it contain a kind of fundamental transformation, but it also contained the fundamental truth of the rules and laws of this world. If he could not understand the root of the rules and laws of this world, how was it possible to completely understand the decomposition and transformation law? Under such circumstances, if Luo Fan wanted to use this decomposition and transformation law to obtain the laws of the untainted world, he could only comprehend the range of influence of each parameter through repeated comparisons and accumulation, and understand the impact caused by the change of each parameter. Only in this way could he extract the parameters of the untainted world, and then bring them into the decomposition and transformation law to obtain what he wanted. Obviously, for him, starting from the untainted world that he was most familiar with was the best choice, and it was also the most effortless choice. With a slight thought, he sat cross-legged, and countless talismans, restrictions, runes, and even endless mysterious patterns began to appear around his body, faintly forming an inexplicable communication with the surrounding laws. These were the decomposition and transformation law, and also the true essence of the painting drawn by the Tao Master's disciple. The surrounding endless laws were constantly changing, and all kinds of indescribable fluctuations were constantly coming from the sky and the ground. Faintly, all kinds of indescribable parameters were absorbed by the various lights and shadows around Luo Fan, but some inexplicable parameters were spat out. As they exchanged with each other, they gradually changed the surrounding laws, causing the surrounding scene to gradually produce all kinds of indescribable changes during this process. Luo Fan gradually thought of the impact of the change in the parameters on the changes in the laws. It could not enhance his understanding of the root of the decomposition and transformation law, but it was enough to give him a deeper understanding of the application of the decomposition and transformation law. This was like a middle school student's understanding of a formula. Perhaps he did not understand how the formula was derived, what impact it had, or what shocking results it could produce. However, this did not prevent him from using this formula to solve the problem, although Luo Fan was making progress all the time, and his understanding of the influence of those parameters was deepening all the time. However, there were simply too many parameters. The number of parameters was calculated in the trillions and trillions, and it would take a lot of effort to analyze just one of them. It went without saying how much time and effort it would take to analyze all of them. Until 1,000,000 years later. He had just barely completed this process and found out the parameters of the entire untainted world and the impact it caused. This was all thanks to his extreme familiarity with the laws of the untainted world. If it were not for this, the time he would need to spend would be at least 100 times more. After 1,000,000 years, he finally completed the understanding of the parameters of a world. He wanted to understand the stars in the sky. How much time would it take to understand the parameters of a perfect world of 12.96 million cubic meters? It was enough to make people despair. If it was in the past, Luo Fan would naturally not be moved because of this. After all, he was an existence that could equate an instant with 1,000,000,000 years. However, at this moment, he could not help but be anxious. Don't forget, his fourth tribulation would descend in 1.8 billion years. During this period of time. Moreover, it wasn't aimed at any absolute time, but at the time he experienced. This made it impossible for him to increase his comprehension time even if he wanted to use methods that could manipulate time. If this goes on, it won't work. Luo Fan sighed and dispersed the laws of the untainted world, returning the place to its original appearance. He raised his head and looked at the endless stars in front of him. His eyes flickered with an inexplicable light. Although there are specific differences between each world, the parameters are still of the same type. Overall, the parameters are still of the same type. Although it is a little troublesome to deduce the parameters of other worlds from the parameters of a certain world, it is not impossible. In this case, perhaps I don't need to understand the parameters of each world at all, and I should be able to understand the essence of the parameters. Such a thought flashed through his mind. This method was a shortcut. However, since it was a shortcut, it represented a risk. Once this shortcut was used well, he would naturally be able to use the shortest time to complete the task that would originally take a long time to complete. However, if this shortcut was not used well, it would be equivalent to completely wasting his effort. Originally, with Luo Fan's mentality, he was not willing to take this shortcut. After all, the original him had plenty of time, and he was not as unable to resist the passage of time as other cultivators. Naturally, it was more appropriate to choose a safer method. However, as mentioned above, the current development of the situation was not up to him. Sighing, Luo Fan could only move his heart slightly and begin to draw down the 12 stars. The laws of the 12 perfect worlds began to fill his surroundings, forming a rather chaotic scene. However, he could still roughly distinguish which 12 perfect worlds belonged to. After that, he did not hesitate and began to compare the endless parameters of the primordial world that he had comprehended previously. He began to comprehend the parameters of the 12 perfect worlds and understand the respective mysteries and effects of these parameters. Compared to the original comprehension, this was much more intuitive. However, he had lost the original search and comprehension. It could be said that there were gains and losses. The many parameters contained in the 12 worlds took Luo Fan a total of 3,000,000 years to completely comprehend them. Although the time it took was still extremely long, it was already much better than before. Moreover, through this, Luo Fan had already preliminarily verified his guess. This kind of shortcut was indeed effective. It could allow him to comprehend the various mysteries of the parameters of the decomposition and transformation rules faster. At least, now, after 3,000,000 years, he had already preliminarily obtained a method to extract the many parameters of a certain world, his heart moved slightly. He dispersed the 12 perfect worlds and once again summoned the 36 stars, causing the chaotic laws and laws of the 36 perfect worlds and laws to combine to fill his surroundings. This degree of chaos was even more chaotic than the original chaotic laws of the 12 worlds. It was also more difficult to distinguish. If he had started from the combination of so many laws, it would have been difficult to start. But now, after 4 million years of hard work, he had already preliminarily obtained his own method. At this time, even in the face of this chaos, he began to work in an orderly manner. As he dissected it like spinning silk from a cocoon, this time, he only spent 2 million years to find the many parameters of the 36 world. Of course, he had made some mistakes, but at the very least, it showed that his previous comprehension was still effective at this time. Luo Fan was already more or less relieved. Originally, it was already enough for him to start the parameter extraction of the world of laws. The difference between the laws of the world of laws obtained and the laws of the true perfect world of laws had become extremely small. On a certain level, it could already be ignored. However, Luo Fan was obviously not satisfied with this. For him, even such an extremely small gap was unacceptable. After all, this was related to whether he could eventually become a true sage and obtain eternity. It was the key to whether he could achieve supreme transcendence. No matter how small the gap was, it was very likely to cause irreparable consequences in the future. How could he tolerate this? Therefore, after this, he did not stop and continued to summon more stars. Just like that, he did it again and again. In the end, after spending nearly 100 million years, which was 1/18 of the time he needed to deal with the fourth tribulation, he finally went through all the 12,960,000 stars in the entire starry sky and perfected the parameter extraction method that he had initially sorted out. He finally reached the point where he could completely extract the parameters of any perfect world after seeing it without any omissions. At least, in the latter half of the worlds, he could no longer make any adjustments to this method, nor could he perfect it in the slightest. At this point, Luo Fan knew that he had already reached the limit of what he could do at present. At this moment, he sighed and broke away from the state of comprehension. The moment he broke away from this state, a crackling sound came from his hand. Then, the boundless starry sky in front of him suddenly became filled with countless cracks, completely enveloping the entire starry sky. It made the starry sky look like it was completely wrapped up by an incomparably huge three-dimensional spider web. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan was shocked. This painting is going to shatter? Just as this thought flashed through his mind, the painting in his hand suddenly collapsed and turned into powder, gradually dissipating in the void. As it disappeared, the extremely mysterious starry sky and the surroundings also completely collapsed. Every star, every law, every piece of space-time had completely and utterly collapsed. In this instant, an extremely powerful force suddenly acted on Luo Fan's body from all directions. In an instant, he was completely crushed, leaving not a single trace of him. It was the disappearance of the painting that caused him to lose his protection. He directly faced all the power of the entire starry sky head-on. In the end, his physical body, his power, his spirit, and even his everything were completely erased at this moment. Fortunately, this power was not targeted at the conceptual level, after all. Fortunately, this power did not target the conceptual level, so although everything about him in the real world had been completely erased, the conceptual level was not damaged at all. At this moment, with just a thought, his body had already reappeared outside the cave abode. It looked no different from when he was erased before. By the time he recovered, the cave dwelling in front of him was already shaking violently. Immediately after, the mountain peak, along with a large portion of the surrounding mountain range, was completely wiped out by a powerful force. Everything was instantly turned into dust. The dozens of cave abodes in the surroundings, along with the cultivators cultivating in them, did not even manage to escape. They were also completely crushed by the powerful force and turned into powder. What a pity for such a good treasure. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan could only sigh. In reality, after witnessing the terrifying commotion caused by the shattering of the painting, he already understood why the painting had shattered. It must be known that the painting had protected him for 100 million years under this terrifying power. Such a long time and such a huge destructive power. Not to mention that it was just a painting, even the disciples of the Tao Master would probably be severely injured if they personally took action. Chapter 1984. The originally bustling mountain range had completely turned into a basin in the blink of an eye. Moreover, it was a barren basin without any smoke or dust or any other material residue. All the vitality that had originally existed had completely disappeared. Even the rules and laws of the world seemed to have never existed here. It was as if this basin was the only thing that had ever existed. This scene instantly dispelled the impulse of the cultivators who were originally interested in this strange change, and they all shrank back. It was just like when they saw Luo Fan bring Hungry Wolf City Lord here 100 million years ago, looking at this basin and feeling the traces that were completely different from the destruction caused by ordinary powers. Luo Fan had a deeper understanding of the power of the painting. At the same time, he had a deeper expectation for the decomposition and transformation law. He did not leave this place. With a slight thought, he entered some parameters into the decomposition and transformation law. With the input of these parameters, the laws of heaven and earth in the surroundings began to gradually change. A mountain range that was exactly the same as before appeared out of thin air where the basin was. It looked exactly the same as before, and even the smallest grass on it was exactly the same. Apart from the fact that the original cultivators no longer existed, everything else made people wonder if the basin they saw before was just an illusion. In fact, this place had always been a complete mountain range. This scene made the cultivators who were paying attention to the changes here feel even more terrified. For a moment, they were very glad that they had shrunk back earlier. This kind of method that was almost like going back in time was naturally nothing in a perfect world. In fact, one would not even need a false sage to be able to do it easily. However, in this world, it was completely different. There was no deep manipulation of the laws of heaven and earth. Even if one reached the Supreme Emperor level, even if one reached the level of Luo Fan, it would be impossible to do this. And if one had a deep understanding of the laws of heaven and earth, then the power that could be exerted was already enough to crush all existences whose comprehension of the laws of heaven and earth was incomparable, at least. It was enough to crush all existences like them who could only watch from the sidelines. It's a pity that there are still some parameters missing. Otherwise, those cultivators would have been able to fully recover. Luo Fan looked at the mountain range and felt somewhat dissatisfied. The number of parameters he had inputted into the decomposition and transformation law was extremely small, but he had extracted all the parameters of this mountain range. Because of this, after he inserted these parameters into the decomposition and transformation law, the decomposition and transformation law began to decompose and transform the laws of this world. Then, it completely constructed the laws that originally existed in this mountain range. Then, through the flow of matter, energy, time, and space in this world itself, everything in this mountain range that was defined by his parameters was naturally restored. Unfortunately, while it was easy to calculate the parameters of a mountain range, it was an extremely complicated process to calculate the parameters of a cultivator. It might be countless times easier than the countless parameters of a perfect world, but it was definitely so complicated that it made people feel despair. If Luo Fan was willing to spend hundreds of thousands of years to deduce the parameters, perhaps it would be enough to completely recover those cultivators. However, it was obvious that he would not waste hundreds of thousands of years to do such a boring thing. It was impossible for him to waste hundreds of thousands of years on such a senseless thing, therefore, the result could only be like this. After the mountain range was restored, Luo Fan did not leave. He had already opened up his cave abode in the mountain range before him, and entered it, disappearing from the eyes of the many cultivators. With this change, this mountain range had become a forbidden area in this region from now on. Any cultivator only dared to open up a cave abode outside this mountain range, and no one dared to step into this mountain range anymore. Even if there were latecomers who did not know this, they would also be warned by other cultivators, and in the end, they had no choice but to abide by this rule. Of course, these cultivators did not have good intentions. They were worried that those latecomers would suffer misfortune because of this, but they were worried that those latecomers would make Luo Fan unhappy. Then, they would make him clean up this region, however. Even so, the number of cultivators here began to increase continuously after this day, and gradually formed a prosperous center of this region. Of course, this was not because those cultivators liked to look for excitement, and they liked to cultivate beside existences who could completely wipe them out at any time, unless they cultivated a special cultivation method or walked a special path. It was impossible for cultivators to have such a mentality. The fundamental reason why more and more cultivators gathered here was very simple. It was because this place was safer than other places. This was not contradictory. Although there was a powerful expert like Luo Fan who could easily wipe out all of them here, it made them feel like accompanying a king was like accompanying a tiger. However, at the same time, it was precisely because of Luo Fan's existence that this region became known as a place that should not be messed with in this entire region. This kind of fame made those cultivators with ulterior motives not dare to set their sights on this area, lest they provoke Luo Fan and bring a calamity upon themselves. This was enough to make this a relatively safe region within a radius of billions of miles. It was also enough to make this place a place that many cultivators who wanted peace flocked to. However, all of this was obviously meaningless to Luo Fan. No matter how much danger or peace the other cultivators received because of him staying here, it had nothing to do with him. What he was concerned about now was his worldview of laws, which was the perfect world of laws that he had obtained through the decomposition and transformation of laws. After stepping into the cave abode, he sat cross-legged in the starry sky and began to sort out the parameters of his world of laws through the method of sorting out parameters that he had concluded after spending hundreds of millions of years. In fact, even the process of summarizing parameters was already an excellent cultivation process for him. How was this process of summarizing parameters deduced from? Wasn't it deduced from the laws of 12,960,000 square meters of perfect heaven and earth? Since that was the case, in that case, if this process of summarizing parameters was applied to his current worldview of laws, wouldn't it be the same as dealing with his current worldview of laws in the same way as dealing with a true sage's worldview of laws? In other words, it was a perfect process. To make an imperfect matching process in this way, what didn't match up and what didn't make sense were naturally the imperfections of his current worldview of laws, and the loopholes that needed to be improved. What was the difference between this and having a teacher constantly judging whether the answers you answered were correct or not? Was there a need to say how many benefits it would bring him? Currently, Luo Fan was only a cultivator who had sensed the existence of the fourth major tribulation and was still far from becoming a true sage. There was still an unknown distance between them. Under such circumstances, there was naturally a huge gap between the worldview of laws that he sorted out and the worldview of laws of the true sage level. With such a huge gap, the errors and omissions in the process of sorting out parameters were simply overwhelming. From the beginning until now, it had been a full 100,000 years. Among the hundreds of trillions of parameters that he had sorted out, only a few 100 million had been successfully sorted out. It was only 1 in a million, even if it was only 1 in a million out of all the parameters. Just this alone. In fact, He could already roughly understand how big the gap between his worldview of laws and the worldview of laws of the true sage level was. 1 in a million. On this day, Luo Fan came back to his senses and sighed inexplicably in his heart. He originally knew that there was still a huge gap between his worldview of laws and that of a true sage level. However, he didn't expect that the gap would reach such a level. His current worldview of laws was actually only 1 in a million of the accuracy of a true sage level. In other words, if he wanted to elevate his worldview to the true saint grade, he would need to reconstruct everything except for a millionth of the worldview. However, Luo Fan was Luo Fan after all. His will was so firm that it would not be shaken even if the world was destroyed. As he sighed, he quickly regained his spirit. Although the quantity is much smaller, at least I have determined which of them are correct. At least I've confirmed which of them are correct. His eyes began to emit an indescribable light. As long as he knew the correct parts, using these parts as the outline, he began to fill in the gap. Refilling, reconstructing, readjusting. In the end, he would be able to improve his accuracy and bring his worldview closer to the true sage level. With this idea in mind, he began to calm down and continue to deduce. Time flew by. Year after year had passed. 100,000 years, another 100,000 years, and another 100,000 years. In the blink of an eye, 1,000,000,000 years had passed. After all, the time needed to sort out the parameters was not linear superposition. Back then, it took him 100,000 years to sort out the parameters that were only 1 in a million, but it only took him 1,000,000,000 years to sort out the remaining millions of parameters. Of course, part of this was because he was the creator of this worldview from scratch. More importantly, through the sorting of the parameters, he became more and more proficient in mastering them as the number increased. Naturally, the speed at which he sorted out the parameters also became faster and faster. Otherwise, how could he complete the process in only 1,000,000,000 years if it took at least tens of billions of years to complete according to the usual superposition process? Of course, this was actually within Luo Fan's expectations. Otherwise, he wouldn't have started this kind of cultivation when he was about to encounter the fourth catastrophe in 1.8 billion years. On this day, Luo Fan, who had sorted out all the parameters, suddenly trembled and opened his eyes. As he opened his eyes, countless Tao talismans, countless restrictions, countless runes, and endless mysterious patterns continuously surged out of his body. Immediately afterward, the surrounding nomological laws began to change continuously. The nomological laws of heaven and earth gradually disintegrated and changed into something that Luo Fan was extremely familiar with. It exuded a strong aura of the worldview of laws. With the appearance of this change, the cave abode he was in began to tremble violently. The boundless starry sky that had originally covered the entire cave abode was completely erased at this moment and was replaced by an inexplicable haze. This kind of haziness was an incomplete and unstable state. It replaced the starry sky and covered the entire cave abode. In other words, it had already become the foundation of the entire cave abode. After the appearance of this haze, Luo Fan felt an indescribable sense of peace and comfort. It was as if the haze in front of him was a part of him, and he was also a part of this haze. This is the real world of laws. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The changes in the surroundings were still ongoing. The nomological laws of heaven and earth were still constantly being decomposed and transformed. With this decomposition and transformation, the surrounding haze continued to increase and thicken. The degree of stability was also constantly increasing. It took him 1,000,000,000 years to sort out and extract the parameters. However, it only took a few days to truly derive these parameters from the decomposition and transformation of the nomological laws of heaven and earth. In just a few days, the cave abode that Luo Fan had opened up had been completely transformed into a hazy world. This was a hazy world, Apart from the haze, there was nothing else. There were no mountains, no rivers, no mountains, and no hills. As for living beings, not even the slightest bit. However, being in such a hazy world, Luo Fan felt unprecedentedly satisfied. In fact, he felt even more satisfied than every breakthrough he had achieved in the past. Compared to breaking through the limit of his lifespan for the first time and obtaining eternal life, compared to seeing the path to becoming a true sage, he felt even more satisfied in this world that was empty except for the haze. He felt as if he had returned to his final destination, as if he had obtained an eternal harbor, as if he had obtained an infinite future, and as if he had set foot on a never-ending path to heaven. This is the real world of laws. He finally voiced out the thoughts that had flashed through his mind before. The hazy world in front of him was naturally nothing else. It was the world of laws derived from the decomposition and transformation of the nomological laws and the parameters he extracted from the world of laws. As for why this world of laws was empty and hazy, the reason was very simple. In fact, the parameters that Luo Fan had input into it were only close to 1/10,000,000th of the parameters needed for a perfect world. That's right, not 1 in a million, but nearly 1 in 10,000,000. This was because the 1 in a million deduction at the beginning was only the probability obtained from a small number of samples. He had to spend 1,000,000,000 years to sort out and extract all the parameters before he could figure out the true probability. In the end, the number of correct parameters accounted for more than 99% of the required parameters, which was close to 1 in 10,000,000. However, this number of parameters that was close to 1 in 10,000,000 was able to form such a hazy world. This could already be considered his world of laws, and it was indeed quite mysterious. What perfect world! Don't even think about it. This situation seemed to be a huge contradiction with the world of laws he had built by relying on the world of laws, but it was actually very easy to understand. Back then, the world of laws he had relied on did not distinguish between the good and the bad, and ignored the flaws and omissions in the world of laws. He had relied on his own assumptions to form the world of laws. Of course, this might have been very unfair to him at that time. After all, to him at that time, that world of laws was already the most perfect world of laws. Every point was well-founded, and he could find evidence to verify it. However, with his understanding of cultivation, chaos, and even a perfect world, the limitations were enough to turn his well-founded deductions into assumptions. The world of laws constructed by that world of laws was indeed complete enough. However, it was already fundamentally different from the world of laws constructed by Luo Fan's true saint-level world of laws. Even though he had once opened up a world of laws and continuously cultivated it into a perfect world, and even made that perfect world surpass its limits time and time again to finally survive the 8th Great Tribulation of the world, it still couldn't change this fact. This could be seen clearly from the fact that the world of laws that had survived the 8th Great Tribulation had completely erased all traces of him. If it really was a perfect world that was completely compatible with his worldview, then its compatibility with him was almost the same as the compatibility between his divine soul and his body. How could it be so easy to get rid of all his imprints and traces so completely? Chapter 1985. This misty world was naturally an extremely incomplete and imperfect world. The laws and laws within were simply broken, but the effects produced by the extremely small portion of the broken laws and laws were already incomparable to the complete laws and laws of the world of laws from before. Facing such broken laws in front of him, it was the first time Luo Fan had such a strong premonition. When this worldview was brought into play to its peak, it could indeed allow him to be free in the state of chaos, unaffected by any changes in the state of chaos, and exist eternally for a long time. The reason for this was very simple. It was because this broken law was extremely stable. It felt like even if it was thrown into the primal chaos state, it wouldn't be destroyed by the primal chaos state. Instead, it would be able to exist for a long time. If it wasn't for the fact that it was too damaged and couldn't completely replace his own body, he might have had the urge to completely fuse the countless laws and laws into his body. After comprehending for a long time in this misty world, Luo Fan sighed leisurely and recovered from this inexplicable feeling of comfort. Unfortunately, it's just derived from the laws of decomposition and transformation and not constructed out of thin air. Luo Fan sighed to himself. The laws derived from the laws of decomposition and transformation seemed to be born from nothing, but in fact it needed a foundation to be born, and that was the existence of the laws of the world. Only the laws of the world could be decomposed and transformed by the laws of decomposition and transformation. Then, the laws of the world of laws would be derived. Under such circumstances, what was the difference between it and directly relying on the world? Not to mention, although such laws seemed to belong to the laws of the world of laws of the perfect world, they were in fact still the laws of the world. If he wanted to extract these laws, what was the difference between that and directly dividing the laws of the world? With his current strength, even if he was stronger, or even close to the true sage realm, he might not be able to extract these laws. Since he could not extract them, then the meaning of the existence of these laws was only to be a sample for him to comprehend. It was impossible for him to have the impulse to directly integrate them into his everything, using it to carry out his everything, supporting him to exist eternally in the state of chaos. Sighing, he sorted out his emotions and began to carefully experience the endless laws and laws in front of him. Through these laws and laws, he began to constantly compare them with his own worldview, constantly strengthening the worldview that was compatible with him, and directly doubting the worldview that was not compatible with him. This was an extremely complicated process. If it wasn't for the fact that he had spent the past 1 billion years working hard to extract the various parameters of that worldview, he wouldn't have been able to do anything about it. He already had a rough target for the worldview corresponding to each of the laws. Perhaps this process would take him billions of years to complete. Under his such behavior around his body, his origin of life, and even the sphere that was the manifestation of his concept of existence, began to undergo various changes. The changes of these many existences were almost completely synchronized, as if they were all derived from the same source. Amidst these changes, it was as if some spots on the sphere had suddenly lit up, causing more and more bright spots to appear on the sphere. It was as if a vast starry sky had been compressed and attached to this sphere bit by bit. Under such circumstances, his worldview was completely different. It became more and more mysterious, more and more profound. Meanwhile, although this change had weakened the degree of perfection, the entire sphere seemed to have become more stable. For example, it used to be ordinary graphite, but now it was constantly replacing certain graphite with diamonds. This situation was clearly because his worldview was becoming more and more stable as he continued to do things. With the change in his worldview, Luo Fan felt an inexplicable sense of comfort. He felt that his sense of security was constantly increasing. In a trance, he even felt that even if he were to step into the state of chaos, he would be able to swim a few laps before dying. This feeling was so strong, but he didn't intend to experiment at all. Dying after swimming a few laps seemed to be much better than dying after entering, but he still had to die in the end. If it wasn't necessary, he didn't want to abandon his life at all. Even if it was just a clone or incarnation like before, he still didn't want to. The number of light spots that were lit up on the sphere increased. The other spheres were either in the illusory plane or inside his body. Although they were still connected to the outside world, it wasn't so easy to find them. However, the sphere around his body was different. This sphere was formed after the space-time dimension was attached to the worldview, and it was in complete contact with the surrounding world. Under such circumstances, as the light spots on the surface of the sphere continued to light up, some kind of flowing light would naturally appear in the surrounding misty world. It would rush out from the depths of the void and pour into the sphere, forming a thread. As it swayed in the misty world, it looked like it had an extra tentacle. As more and more light spots lit up on the sphere, the number of tentacles seemed to increase. And the surrounding misty world also became thinner and thinner, as if it was constantly being absorbed by these tentacles, gradually turning into a part of these tentacles. This process lasted for nearly 100,000 years. On this day, when the last speck of light lit up, the entire misty world instantly collapsed. The last bit of law that made up it at this moment, the last light spot merged and directly connected to the sphere around Luo Fan's body, connecting with the last light spot. At this moment, the numerous tentacles waved and swayed continuously. As for the nothingness that was formed after the collapse of the dreamland, the absolute nothingness that originally needed to endure the forceful suppression of the laws of the outside world was completely supported by these tentacles at this moment, as if it was supported by pillars. It was completely unaffected by the laws of the outside world, and still maintained that absolute nothingness. It seemed so stable, as if this place was supposed to be this kind of nothingness, and at this moment, the number of light spots on the sphere was already innumerable, densely packed, simply more than the number of stars in the starry sky. A complete view of the world was too complex and complicated. Even though Luo Fan had only lit up 1/10,000,000th of it, but even so, the number contained within was already incalculable. With such a sphere wrapped around him, Luo Fan felt like he was standing in the center of the universe, like a god of creation who controlled the life and death of the entire universe. He even felt as if the universe would be turned upside down with every breath he took. After doing what he needed to do, he slowly opened his eyes, revealing an inexplicable joy in them. It's really very effective. I can feel it now. My cultivation realm has at least increased by a level. At this moment, an indescribable pressure suddenly arose from the bottom of his heart. This pressure made him frown, and the joy in his eyes also faded. He carefully sensed it, and couldn't help but feel happy and sad at the same time. The source of this pressure was none other than his fourth tribulation. After his cultivation realm had been improved, he felt that his fourth tribulation was coming. It had been brought forward again. From the original 700 or 800 million years, it had been brought forward to less than 100 million years. More specifically, it would descend after 780,000 years, and in his senses, he was now. Although it was safer to go through the fourth tribulation than before, which meant that the probability of passing through was higher, it was still extremely dangerous, and the possibility of failure was still extremely high. Because of this, he felt such a strong sense of pressure. It seems that the road of Tao Master, after all, still needs to be tried. He sighed to himself. With the fourth tribulation hanging over his head, he didn't have the mood to be narcissistic. His heart moved slightly and his eyes narrowed. The countless light spots around his body began to gradually disappear, and in the blink of an eye, it had completely disappeared. And when the space-time dimension around his body transformed into a ball, the many tentacles that were originally connected to the ball trembled slightly, and their connection with the ball was completely cut off. They were swept by an indescribably terrifying power, and completely collapsed, disintegrating into a misty world. Then, the power did not stop and continued to affect the misty world, causing the misty world to continue to transform, reorganize, and gradually integrate with the rules and dharma of the outside world. In a short moment, it had completely transformed into the rules and dharma of the outside world, and once again filled the cave residence around Luo Fan, forming a starry sky. As expected, it's still the rules and dharma of the world in the end. With my strength, it's impossible to cut it off. Luo Fan could not help but sigh when he saw this scene. It must be known that if the misty world was really created by him out of thin air, then as the space-time dimension disappeared, it would be completely sucked dry and become a part of the space-time dimension. How could it be cut off like this? This was a fact that he had already expected, but he did not waste too much time thinking about it. With a thought, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. In a flash, he had already left the cave residence, and arrived above the mountain range that had become an extremely special area in this region. This mountain range had already become extremely special because of his actions back then. God knows how many living beings had gathered nearby because of the uniqueness of this mountain range. In such a situation, how could those living beings not pay attention to the situation of this mountain range? As soon as he appeared, he instantly attracted the attention of an unknown number of living beings. Waves of perception and gazes gathered from all directions. Luo Fan scanned the surrounding scene of this mountain range, and with a thought, he already understood what had happened. Other than secretly feeling that all living beings in any world sought good fortune and avoided calamity, he did not feel anything else. However, although he did not care much about the changes in his surroundings, it did not mean that he was willing to be scanned by the perception of the many cultivators. Hence, in this instant, before the perception could approach him, he snorted coldly, and an inexplicable might was released from his body, instantly blasting towards these perceptions. The cultivators who released these perceptions were strong and weak. The strong ones were even supreme emperors, while the weak ones were close to false sages. If it was any other place, at any other time, any such perception would probably be enough to destroy the world. However, at this moment, facing the might that Luo Fan slightly released, these countless perceptions were like pieces of paper, and all of them were completely crushed in an instant. The countless cultivators around this mountain range felt an indescribable pain through the crushed perception. All of them could not help but groan, and at the same time, a look of shock and excitement appeared on their faces. Shock was naturally due to Luo Fan's strength. As for excitement, it was even simpler. It was because the more powerful Luo Fan was, the more it showed that their choice to settle here was the right one. Luo Fan didn't pay much attention to these cultivators. After crushing the perception of the many cultivators, after crushing the numerous perceptions, he identified the direction and disappeared from this area with a flash, heading towards the Heaven Cave Peak that the City Lord of Hungry Wolf City had pointed out. Although the more important use of the decomposition and transformation rule was to obtain the laws of perfect heaven and earth, the extraction of the decomposition and transformation rule was already enough for living beings who could not control the laws of heaven and earth to perform many operations on the laws of heaven and earth. For example, Luo Fan could now easily use this decomposition and transformation rule to do everything that he could do in a perfect world. Among them, he could move time and space. He could change the laws of heaven and earth, and even go deep into the laws of heaven and earth. However, this was no longer a problem for the current him and his method of disappearing. To the many cultivators here, this was a great stimulation. How could he do this without playing with the laws of heaven and earth like plasticine? For a cultivator to have the ability to play with the laws of this world, they simply couldn't imagine what kind of level that would be. Could it be that he's a disciple of a Tao master? My God! Have we been relying on a Tao master all this time? A cultivator exclaimed in disbelief. As a cultivator who was close to a false sage, even if he released his voice without concealment in this world, it would definitely be earth-shattering. This cultivator could not control his emotions, so how could he control his voice? As a result, this sentence spread out for who knows how many tens of thousands of kilometers. Almost all the cultivators here heard it in an instant. The moment they heard this voice, the expressions of almost all the cultivators changed. Some cultivators became excited, some became regretful, some became helpless, and some even became angry. There were even many cultivators who revealed hatred. These changes in emotions represented the different attitudes of the cultivators towards the possibility that Luo Fan might be a Tao master's disciple. What a pity! If I had known earlier, I would have gone to make friends with him even if I had to risk angering him. Such a thought flashed through a cultivator's mind. This was the emotion in the heart of the regretful cultivator. This kind of cultivator was obviously a cultivator who was extremely adventurous. So he's a Tao master's disciple. I didn't expect to meet such a person even after hiding in this chaotic region. He's like a ghost that won't go away. This was the thought in the heart of the cultivator who had developed hatred. This was not impossible. Just like how there were mortals who hated the rich, there were also cultivators who hated the rich. And the existence of a Tao master's disciple had the supreme Tao master as their backer. In the eyes of cultivators, they were naturally the richest. It should be known that this Tao master was not the Tao master realm, that Lu Fuan had divided into several realms among the quasi-sage realms. Instead, it was the title of true sage in this world. What other identity could make a cultivator hate the rich more than a Tao master's disciple? Naturally, Luo Fan did not care about the emotions of the many cultivators after he left and how they beat their chests and stamped their feet. In the short span of a few breaths after leaving the mountain range, he had crossed countless light years and appeared in front of Heaven Cave Peak. This Heaven Cave Peak was not an ordinary mountain, but a mountain peak that was inverted and suspended in the sky. It did not stand on the ground, but was inverted and suspended in the sky. It was large at the top and small at the bottom, and there was nothing in the middle. It looked like a cave that led to the sky. Perhaps this was the origin of the name Heaven Cave Peak. Chapter 1986. The surroundings of this Heaven Cave Peak were densely packed with inverted objects that were floating in the air. Some were islands, some were oceans, some were mystical ancient trees, some were continents, and there were even quite a few similar mountains. Among them, most of the inverted objects that were suspended in the air had holes in them. In such an environment, this Heaven Cave Peak was nothing more than an ordinary object. Naturally, it was not eye-catching at all. Of course, since the Hungry Wolf City Lord was able to discover this, there were naturally other cultivators who had discovered it as well. Therefore, it was not that there was no one here. Instead, there were some cultivators gathered here, and from time to time, there would be cultivators who would enter the Tao Sovereign's path. Not all cultivators would make all the necessary preparations before entering the Tao Sovereign path. Where there were people, there would be grudges and there would be strife. This world was naturally no exception. On the contrary, in such a stable world, the strife would only be more intense, and there would be even less to worry about. Therefore, there would naturally be cultivators who could no longer survive in this world due to the strife, and could only hide on the Tao Sovereign path in order to seek a final chance at survival. Of course, there were also many cultivators who were blinded by hatred, and felt that their enemies were far too strong, and that they could not match up to them under normal circumstances. Therefore, they could only throw caution to the wind, and place their last hope on the Tao Sovereign path, and thus step onto it. These various reasons were different, but the final result was that many cultivators who clearly had little hope of passing the Tao Master's path stepped onto the Tao Master's path one after another. Looking at this Heaven Cave Peak, Luo Fan recalled the memories he had obtained from Hungry Wolf City Lord. With a thought, his figure flashed, and he had already arrived within the vicinity of this Heaven Cave Peak. The moment he arrived at this place, he suddenly felt that the laws around him were inexplicably different from the outside world, vaguely distorting his perception. This is... Should I reverse up and down? After a brief analysis, Luo Fan already understood the purpose of this inexplicable law. This law would completely reverse the original definition of up and down in the outside world. It would cause down to become up and up to become down. In other words, it would cause this Heaven Cave Peak to become a normal mountain in the eyes of ordinary people. With a thought, Luo Fan released the suppression of the rules. Under the influence of the rules, his perception began to change. His body, which was originally normal, suddenly turned upside down. Adjusting his body, Zhang Xian looked down once more. The celestial cave peak had returned to normal, but the land beneath him had been transformed into the sky, an incomparably stifling pressure weighing down on his head. Doesn't it look spectacular? At this moment, a voice entered Luo Fan's ears. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. He had already discovered that a tree at the foot of the mountain was speaking. The tree was only 30 feet tall. It was only big enough for 2 people to hug it. However, his body gave off an extremely ancient aura. An extremely ancient aura. It was as if it had lived for hundreds of millions of years. At this moment, an old face appeared on the tree. He was looking up at the boundless land above him, and his expression was somewhat emotional and intoxicated. It is indeed spectacular. Although it's just a change of perspective, the feeling is already completely different. Luo Fan smiled. As he spoke, his figure had already landed under the tree. I am Luo Fan. May I know how I should address you? He was interested in this tree and asked. Around this tree, there were many trees that were similar to this one. However, the other trees were different from this one. Although they also possessed intelligence, they were not as active, nor did they have such vigor. If one had to make a comparison, they looked more like they were in a deep sleep. This old man is a tree. What name do I have? However, you can call me Old Antique. The tree laughed. Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled and said, Old Antique? In terms of age, perhaps you are even younger than me. The tree only chuckled and said, Little fella, how many years do you think I have lived for? Luo Fan smiled and said, According to my senses, you should have lived for about 3,867. 3 billion years. Old Antique was taken aback by Luo Fan's words. He had never expected Luo Fan to be able to calculate so clearly. This was even clearer than his own calculations. According to his calculations, he had only lived for close to 31 trillion years. How do you know? He could not help but ask. Ordinary trees have annual rings, and an extraordinary ancient tree like you also has annual rings. I just need to calculate a little, and I will naturally know. Is it very difficult? Luo Fan only smiled. If that's the case, are you still confident that you can live longer than me? The old antique asked in surprise. Is 31 trillion years very long? I've been cultivating for who knows how many 31 trillion years. Luo Fan laughed heartily. He wasn't lying. In terms of the time he had spent speeding up his cultivation and the time his mind had spent in each tribulation, the time he had lived was probably countless times longer than that. With this kind of background, he absolutely had the right to look down on the old antique's lifespan. The old antique's eyes were full of reverence as it said, You've lived for so long, how can you maintain such a lively attitude? I don't see any traces of the vicissitudes of time in your eyes. It didn't suspect that Luo Fan was lying at all. After all, it had no meaning in itself. When Luo Fan heard this, he just sighed and said, When you have lived for a long enough time and let the traces of time leave a deep enough mark on your body, you will find that in your perception, time will completely change into another form of existence. When that time comes, the vicissitudes of time won't appear again. Hearing this, the old antique seemed to understand but not quite, as if he could sense that what Luo Fan had said was true wisdom, but he couldn't find the crux of it no matter how hard he tried. Ha ha! I didn't expect fellow Taoists to be so interested in chatting with these old antiques. Although they've lived for a long time, their strength isn't much at all. If it weren't for the fact that they've fused with Heaven Cave Peak, it would have been very difficult to destroy them without harming them. I don't know how long ago, but they were completely destroyed. At this time, a loud laugh came from the sky. Luo Fan looked up and saw a cultivator looking at them with interest in the sky. The cultivator was a fat man. His strength was so great that it actually surpassed that of a supreme emperor. If that was all, Luo Fan wouldn't have cared too much. The reason why he was concerned was that this fatty actually gave him an indescribable pressure. It was as if the fatty could threaten him. This isn't the kind of cultivator who staked everything on a single throw, but the kind of cultivator who's already prepared and confident enough to pass through the path of a Tao master. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. You're here again. I've seen you 3 times in the past trillion years, and this is the 4th time. How fast? The old antique looked at the fatty and suddenly smiled. Hearing this, the fatty's expression changed, and he said, "What? You said you've seen me 3 times? This is clearly my first time here, so how could you have seen me 3 times? It seems you still don't know. What a pity, what a real pity." The old man sighed. The old antique sighed and looked at the fatty sympathetically. At this time, the fatty was no longer leisurely, and his eyes were so gloomy that it looked like they were about to drip water. Don't be fooled by this fatty's words about these old antique trees being worthless. But in fact, these ancient trees were quite famous in this large area, and their biggest reputation was that they wouldn't lie. Even if it was the cultivators they hated the most, the words that came out of their mouths could definitely be verified, and not a single word was a lie. Since it said that it had seen him 3 times, it could only mean that he had really appeared 3 times. However, he clearly had no impression of this. This caused him to be unable to help but feel slightly shocked and bewildered. What about me? How many times have I appeared? Luo Fan just smiled. He asked Gu Mu. This is the 2nd time you've appeared. Gu Mu smiled. I see. Luo Fan listened. He laughed as well. However, he had already vaguely guessed what was going on. Of course, it was only a guess. He would have to verify it in the future. Moreover, even if the situation wasn't as he had guessed, and something even stranger and more unbelievable happened, he wouldn't care at all. He had already encountered this kind of situation countless times, and he had even killed himself time and time again during the Great Calamity. Under such circumstances, even if another version of himself appeared, he was absolutely confident that he would be able to defeat it. Under such circumstances, there was naturally nothing for him to worry about. At this time, when the fatty saw Luo Fan and Gu Mu behaving like this, he suddenly snorted. It seems that the rumors are false. In the end, you still know how to lie. With that, he couldn't be bothered with Luo Fan and the old antique anymore. He turned around and directly rushed into the hole in the center of Heaven Cave Peak. At this time, the old antique said to Luo Fan, "In order to thank you for your guidance, I will give you this leaf. Perhaps in the future, it will be of some rare use. Who knows, the last time I saw you, you might disappear because of this." As he spoke, a leaf naturally broke off from the branch and slowly floated down, landing in front of Luo Fan. When this leaf broke off from the branch, it looked very ordinary, like an ordinary leaf the size of a palm. However, as it floated down, various indescribable laws started to gradually infuse into the leaf, causing it to gradually emit a dusky glow, as if the primal chaos was being compressed into it. As he grabbed this leaf, Luo Fan instantly sensed that it contained an indescribable power and laws. This power and laws were extremely stable. Even for him, it was extremely difficult to mobilize these power and laws. In fact, it could be said to be almost impossible. However, this power and laws were faintly connected to the tree in front of him, and could guide him to the direction of this tree at any time. When he understood this, he only smiled slightly. He thanked the ancient tree. The ancient tree seemed to have suffered a great deal of damage after losing that leaf. At this moment it became powerless and said, "Go. Go, I can sense it. Now is the best time for you to enter the Tao Master Path. After this time, it will be 10 times more troublesome to enter." When he heard this, Luo Fan did not care at all. With just a thought, the laws and laws around him naturally broke down and transformed, enveloping the ancient tree in front of him. Under this transformation, the ancient tree was like rain after a long drought. It began to frantically absorb these laws and laws. The damage and exhaustion caused by the shedding of the leaves were quickly recovered. In just a few breaths' time, it had completely recovered. Even the leaf had grown back. Gumu couldn't help but be stunned by the speed at which they were moving. At this moment, a confused voice came from around him. "What is this? It smells so good. It smells so good." Then, with a whooshing sound, many ancient trees that were originally in a deep sleep began to shake their branches and leaves. They began to look over. Obviously, the laws that Luo Fan had broken down and transformed were too tempting. The ancient trees that were in a deep sleep were actually startled awake. At this moment they instinctively searched for these laws and laws. Seeing this, Luo Fan just smiled. He casually scattered the laws and integrated them into the many ancient trees. This caused the many ancient trees to sigh in satisfaction, but that was all. After all, they were just leftovers. These ancient trees only felt comfortable for a moment. They did not benefit as much as the old antique in front of Luo Fan. "It seems I've made a huge profit this time," the old antique said with a tinge of emotion. "Let's go." Luo Fan just smiled and said no more. He turned around and headed towards the secret entrance of the Tao Master Path in the center of Heaven Cave Peak. Hearing this, the ancient trees did not ask him to stay. They just rustled their branches and leaves. Although the surrounding ancient trees were still a little dissatisfied after obtaining the many laws that Luo Fan had spread out, they were unable to resist their instincts and awaken from their slumber under the temptation of having no more laws and laws. Therefore, they had already gradually returned to their slumber, once again returning to their previous calm state. Without their turbulence, this place seemed to have returned to its original state before Luo Fan appeared. It looked as if nothing had happened. At the center of the Heaven Cave Peak, there was a hole that seemed to lead to the outer world. It looked extremely deep and serene. Even with Luo Fan's eyesight, he could not see the bottom or the end of it. It was as if there was an incomparably deep and profound space waiting for him there. The Tao Master Path, what does it look like? Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat and an inexplicable expression appeared on his face. His heart slightly moved. He lifted his foot and took a light step, directly crossing into the abyss. The moment he crossed the boundary between the inside and the outside, he felt that the laws around him suddenly became completely strange and different. The stability that originally belonged to the universe had completely turned into a kind of turbulence, a kind of chaos, as if it had suddenly been stirred up by some huge force. There was an inexplicable force acting out of thin air behind him, constantly pushing him quickly into the depths of the abyss. This force was so strong and so absolute that even with his strength, he could not resist it at all. He could only continue to move forward under the push of this force. He couldn't even turn his head to look at the scenery behind him anymore. As expected of the Tao Master Path, just this entrance alone is already enough to make me unable to resist. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind at this time. With this thought in mind, he had a deeper expectation of whether the Tao Master Path could help him break through and become a Tao Master. If he couldn't control or influence the Tao Master's path, then what was the use of it? How could he still believe that the Tao Master's path contained the mystery that could help him break through and become a Tao Master? At this moment, a spiritual light suddenly appeared around him, and an inexplicable suction was produced from the spiritual light. It began to act on Luo Fan, trying to suck him into it. Feeling this kind of divine light, Luo Fan frowned slightly. This divine light seemed mysterious, but he could faintly feel that it was not a normal Tao Master's path. If he was thrown into it, it might not be fatal to him, but it would definitely cause trouble for him on the Tao Master path. Thus, at this moment, his heart skipped a beat. His power shook and he broke free from the suction force produced by the spiritual light. Although the suction was strong, it was after all not as absolute as the force pushing him from behind. After he broke free, it naturally no longer had any effect on him. As he broke free from this suction, the spiritual light disappeared in the blink of an eye, as if it had never appeared.